They kicked a grandmother out of her home, but in her purse was $3 million hidden. Margaret Wilson clutched her old brown leather purse tightly, as if it were the last shred of dignity she had left. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face as the harsh words of her own son echoed across the porch of the house she had lived in for 40 years. "Mum, we've made our decision. You can't stay here anymore." Richard's voice was cold, without a trace of the tenderness she remembered from his childhood. Behind him, Patricia stood with her arms crossed, her impatient gaze fixed on her mother-in-law. There was a cruel satisfaction in her eyes, as if she had finally gotten what she always wanted. "But son, this is my home. Your father and I built every brick of these walls with so much sacrifice." Margaret tried to step closer, but Richard took a step back. "It was your home, Mom. Now it's ours. You signed the deed of gift 2 years ago, remember?" Patricia spoke for the first time, her voice sharp as a blade. Margaret pressed the purse even tighter against her chest. Inside it, aside from a few coins and documents, was something no one suspected. Something that could completely change this humiliating situation. But she couldn't reveal it, not yet. "Where will I live? I'm a 72-year-old woman." Her voice trembled, not just from sadness, but from a growing anger she could barely contain. "That's no longer our problem." Richard turned his back on her. "You have 1 hour to gather your things and leave." The door shut with a sharp click, leaving Margaret alone on the porch where she had so often enjoyed breakfast while admiring the garden she had lovingly tended. The scent of the roses she had planted decades ago now seemed bitter. She looked at the purse once more. The stacks of money were well hidden in the false bottom she had commissioned years ago, back when she still worked as a seamstress and saved every penny. $3 million she had accumulated over decades, the result of an unexpected inheritance from a distant aunt no one in the family even knew about. But revealing that money now would be like handing Richard and Patricia everything she had, worked for her entire life on a silver platter. No, she needed a better plan. With slow steps, Margaret descended the porch stairs and walked toward the gate. Each step ached, not just in her tired legs, but in her shattered heart. 40 years. 5 memories were left behind. 40 years of a life she had thought mattered to someone. On the sidewalk, she stopped and looked back one last time. The 2-story house painted light blue, with the windows she had picked herself. The garden she had tended every day. All of it now belonged to people who didn't have an ounce of gratitude for what she had done for them. "Mrs. Wilson?" A gentle voice made her turn. It was Carmen, the 70-year-old neighbor who had lived next door for over 20 years. Her eyes were filled with concern. "What happened? I saw you arguing on the porch." Carmen stepped closer, noticing the devastation on her friend's face. Margaret couldn't answer right away. The words seemed stuck in her throat, mixed with shame and pain. "They kicked me out, Carmen. My own son put me out." Finally, the words came out in a broken whisper. Carmen fell silent for a moment, processing the information. She had known Richard since he was a child, had seen Margaret raise him alone. After her husband died of a heart attack, she knew all the sacrifices this woman had made. "What do you mean they kicked you out? Isn't the house yours?" Carmen asked, though she already suspected the answer. "It was. I signed a deed of gift 2 years ago. Richard said it was to simplify tax matters, that I could keep living there as usual." Margaret wiped her tears with the sleeve of her beige coat. "I was a fool to trust them." The weight of the purse in her arms constantly reminded her of the secret she carried. $3 million that could solve not just her situation, but also show Richard and Patricia how much they had underestimated the woman they had just humiliated. "Come to my house, let's talk calmly and figure out what to do." Carmen offered her arm for Margaret to lean on. As they walked the short distance to the neighboring house, Margaret could feel the stares of people on the street. The news that Mrs. Wilson had been thrown out of her own home by her son would surely spread quickly through the neighborhood. The shame consumed her, but it also fueled something stronger, a determination she hadn't felt in years. Carmen's house was smaller and simpler than hers, but it had something hers had lacked for a long time: genuine warmth. The two friends sat in the small living room, where family photos smiled from the walls and well-tended plants decorated every corner. "Tell me everything, Margaret, from the beginning." Carmen poured chamomile tea into flowered cups. Margaret began recounting the last 2 years since Patricia entered Richard's life, how her daughter-in-law had gradually taken control of the house, changing furniture, altering routines, making Margaret feel like a stranger in her own home. "She never liked me, Carmen, from day one. And Richard, my Richard has changed completely." Margaret held the cup with both hands, seeking warmth and comfort. "But why did you sign over the house?" Carmen pressed the question that puzzled her most. "Richard said there was a new law, that elderly people risked losing their homes if they didn't transfer ownership to their children. He said it was just to protect me." Margaret shook her head, acknowledging her own naivety. What Richard didn't know, nor did Patricia, was that Margaret had been far cleverer than she seemed in other matters. The money in her purse was proof of that, but now she needed to decide how to use that advantage. "So what now? Where will you stay?" Carmen asked, genuinely concerned. "I don't know. I have some savings. Maybe I can rent a small room somewhere." Margaret lied about the amount, but not about her determination not to rely on anyone's charity. Just then, Carmen's phone rang. It was her son, Mark, who called every afternoon to check on his mother. Margaret listened to the loving exchange between mother and son and felt a pang of envy mixed with sadness. When Carmen hung up, Margaret couldn't hide the bitterness in her voice. "You're lucky, Carmen. Mark treats you the way a mother deserves to be treated." "Margaret, I have an idea." Carmen suddenly perked up. "Mark knows a very good lawyer. Maybe you can challenge this transfer. If you were tricked..." "No, Carmen. I signed willingly. Even if it was based on lies, there's no way to..." "Prove it." Margaret sighed deeply. But inside, she was crafting a different plan, one that would show Richard and Patricia exactly who they had disrespected. Not through courts or lawyers, in a far more personal and direct way. The afternoon was fading when Margaret finally rose from Carmen's chair. The purse felt heavier with each passing hour, not from the money, but from the weight of the decisions she knew she'd have to make. "Carmen, can you do me a favor?" Margaret asked, already near the door. "Of course, anything you need. Don't tell anyone about what happened today, at least not yet. I need time to think." Margaret adjusted the purse strap on her shoulder. "But Margaret, where will you sleep tonight?" Carmen insisted, worried. "I'll find a place. Don't worry about me." Margaret hugged her friend tightly. "Thank you for listening, it meant a lot." Leaving Carmen's house, Margaret walked through the streets of the neighborhood where she had lived her entire adult life. Every corner, every tree, every house held a memory. There she had raised Richard. There she had mourned the loss of her husband. There she had dreamed of a peaceful future surrounded by family. But dreams, she had discovered that they don't always become reality the way we expect. Margaret stopped in front of a small inn in the center of town. It wasn't luxurious, but it looked clean and honest. With $3 million in her bag, she could have stayed at the best hotel in the area, but that would have drawn unnecessary attention. "Good evening. I'd like a room for a few nights," Margaret said to the receptionist, a young woman with a warm smile. "Of course, ma'am. We have a simple room on the second floor. $40 a night," the woman replied, showing the options. On the computer. Margaret paid for 5 nights in cash, taking out only a few small bills from the visible part of her bag. Every move was calculated to avoid raising suspicions about the fortune she carried. The room was small but comfortable, a single bed, a tiny bathroom, and a window overlooking the town's main street. Margaret sat on the bed and finally opened her bag completely. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. There they were, $300 bills, neatly bundled and recounted carefully over the years. $3 million that represented not just money, but the independence she had never revealed to anyone. Aunt Eunice's inheritance had come completely unexpectedly 3 years earlier. Margaret hadn't even known her aunt had grown wealthy through smart investments over her lifetime. The lawyer who contacted her explained that Eunice had left everything to her because she was the only niece who had stayed in touch, even if sporadically through letters. At the time, Margaret had considered telling Richard about the money, but something made her hesitate. Maybe a protective maternal instinct, or perhaps wisdom that comes with age. She decided to keep it secret and see how things unfolded. It was a wise decision. Just a few months after the inheritance, Richard met Patricia, and Margaret began noticing subtle changes in her son's behavior. Small rudeness, impatience, sarcastic remarks about her old-fashioned ways. Now, lying on that unfamiliar bed, Margaret finally understood her intuition had been right all along. Richard and Patricia didn't love or respect her. She was just a burden in their lives, and the house was the only real interest they had in her. But they had made a grave mistake by underestimating her. Margaret wasn't just a frail, dependent old woman. She was a woman who had survived decades of hardship, raised a child alone, and built a life with determination and intelligence. And now she would use all that experience to show them what it meant to mess with the wrong person. Margaret tucked the money away again and lay down. Tomorrow would begin the execution of a plan she had been forming in her mind. A plan that wouldn't involve petty revenge but poetic justice. The next morning, Margaret woke earlier than usual. The first part of her plan involved a visit to the bank, where she had maintained a small checking account for decades. She needed information and, more importantly, to establish a new financial relationship without raising suspicion. The bank manager, Mr. Augustus, had known her for over 15 years. He was an honest and discreet man, qualities Margaret would need now. "Mrs. Wilson, what a surprise to see you here so early," Augustus said, standing to greet her. "Good morning, Augustus. I need to talk to you about some financial matters." Margaret sat in the chair across from his desk. "Of course. How can I help you?" Margaret took a deep breath before answering. This would be the first time she revealed her true financial situation to anyone. "I need to make some significant investments and bank transactions, and I need this done with absolute discretion." She paused to gauge his reaction. Augustus was experienced enough to know that when a client mentioned discretion and significant transactions, there was usually a complex story behind it. "Mrs. Wilson, you know we maintain absolute banking confidentiality. You can speak freely." He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "I have $3 million in cash that I need to deposit and invest," Margaret said bluntly, watching the manager's surprised expression. Augustus remained silent for a few seconds, processing the information. Mrs. Wilson, the retired seamstress who kept a simple account with just a few $1,000s, had just mentioned an amount that would completely change her profile as a client. "Pardon me, ma'am, but did you say 3 million? Augustus wanted to confirm he'd heard correctly. "Exactly. A family inheritance I received a few years ago and kept at home for personal reasons." Margaret didn't lie. She just omitted a few details. "Mrs. Wilson, an amount of this magnitude requires some special procedures. We need to verify the source of the funds, file reports with the IRS." Augustus began explaining the legal steps. "I have all the inheritance documentation. Everything is legal and declared." Margaret opened her purse and showed the papers proving her Aunt Eunice's inheritance. Augustus examined the documents carefully. Everything seemed in order. The Kasham inheritance had been properly registered, taxes paid, all by the book. "Very well, we can proceed. But why do you want to move this money now?" The manager's curiosity was professional but also personal. He'd known Margaret for years and knew she was a cautious person. Margaret hesitated for a moment, telling, the truth about being kicked out of her home would be humiliating, but perhaps necessary to earn the manager's full trust. "My family situation has changed recently. I need to reorganize my finances to gain more independence." She opted for a condensed version of the truth. Augustus understood there was more behind that answer, but respected his client's privacy. "Understood. What do you have in mind? Conservative investments? Fixed income?" He picked up some informational brochures. "I want to diversify. Part in safe investments, part in something that gives me quick access to the money if I need it." Margaret was thinking ahead about her plans. "Perfectly feasible. I'd suggest a mixed approach, 50% in government bonds, 20% in conservative investment funds, and 30% in a high-yield savings account for large sums." Augustus sketched out a plan on paper. And how much would that yield per month? Margaret asked, doing mental calculations. With this allocation and the current interest rates, approximately $20,000 a month. Augustus laid out the numbers in detail. Margaret smiled for the first time since being forced out of her home. $20,000 a month was more than she used to spend in 6 months living with Richard. That money wouldn't just give her total independence. It would give her the power to choose how to handle her situation. Let's proceed, Margaret decided, but I want everything done today, if possible. Mrs. Wilson, for a transaction of this size, we'll need at least 48 hours for all the procedures, Augustus explained, and you would need to bring the money in cash for us to make the deposit. All right, tomorrow morning I'll be here with everything. Margaret stood up, feeling more confident than she had in months. Leaving the bank, she walked through the city streets with renewed purpose. She was no longer the rejected elderly woman who had left home the day before. She was a 72-year-old woman with $3 million and a plan to show the world who she truly was. But first, she needed to settle a practical matter, finding a permanent place to live. She wouldn't return to Richard's house, even if he begged her. That chapter of her life was definitively over. Margaret decided to visit a few real estate agencies in the city. She wasn't looking for anything luxurious, but she wanted something dignified, comfortable, and truly her own. At the first agency, she was assisted by a young agent who looked at her with some indifference when Margaret mentioned she was interested in renting an apartment. "We have some simpler options, suitable for a retiree's budget," said Jessica, the agent, showing pictures of small studio apartments in distant neighborhoods. "Actually, I'm interested in something better." Margaret kept her composure, though she could sense the prejudice in the young woman's attitude. "Ma'am, nicer apartments require proof of higher income. Can you verify a monthly income of at least $5,000? Jessica asked skeptically. Margaret smiled inwardly. If only she knew that starting the next day, she'd have a monthly income of $20,000. "Never mind, thank you." Margaret stood up and left the agency. Her second attempt was at a smaller real estate office where she was assisted by Mr. John, a man around 60, who treated her with respect from the very beginning. "How can I help you, ma'am?" He waited for her to introduce herself. Margaret Wilson, I'm looking for an apartment to rent." She sat in the chair he offered. "What kind of apartment do you have in mind?" John asked without making any assumptions about her financial situation. 2 bedrooms, living room, kitchen, something comfortable but not excessive. Margaret described her actual needs. "I have some interesting options. Here's an apartment downtown, 2nd floor, with a view of the square." John showed pictures of an apartment that looked perfect. "How much is the rent?" Margaret asked. $2,500 a month, plus a $300 maintenance fee. John was transparent about the costs. "Can I see it today?" Margaret was immediately interested. "Of course, do you have proof of income?" John asked, but his tone was professional, without insinuations. "I'll organize the paperwork today and bring everything tomorrow. Can we schedule a viewing for this afternoon?" Margaret suggested. "Perfectly. Is 3 o'clock good for you?" John noted the time in his planner. Margaret left the agency feeling much better. She had finally found someone who treated her as a dignified person, not as a problematic elderly woman. The apartment she visited that afternoon exceeded her expectations. It was spacious, well lit, with simple but good quality furniture. The view from the living room window showed the city's main square, where she could sit and watch life go by. "This is exactly what I was looking for," Margaret told John after touring every room. "Great. Then tomorrow you can bring the paperwork and we can finalize the contract." John seemed genuinely pleased to help her. That night, back in her in-room, Margaret gathered all the documents she would need: proof of income from the bank, personal identification, references. Tomorrow would be a day of big changes. But before going to sleep, she did something she hadn't done in years. She planned her future. Not just the practical aspects like housing and money, but also how to use her new situation to deal with Richard and Patricia. She wasn't seeking revenge in the destructive sense of the word, but she wanted them to understand the mistake they had made. She wanted them to feel in their own skin what it meant to underestimate someone. Margaret knew that sooner or later, Richard and Patricia would find out about her financial situation. When that happened, she wanted to be in a position of absolute, a strength, where she could choose exactly how to react. The next morning, Margaret woke up early and prepared for what would be one of the most important days of her life. She put on her best outfit, carefully combed her hair, and adjusted the bag she would carry with $3 million through the city streets. The walk to the bank was uneventful, but Margaret felt the weight of responsibility with every step. It wasn't just the physical weight of the money, but the symbolic weight of what that moment represented, her declaration of ultimate independence. Augustus was waiting for her with all the paperwork ready. The process of depositing such a large sum would take a few hours, but he had arranged everything to be as discreet as possible. "Mrs. Wilson, we'll do this in stages to avoid unnecessary." "Attention," Augustus explained the procedure. Over the next 3 hours, Margaret watched her official transformation from a retiree with few resources to a woman of considerable wealth. Every signature, every processed document was another step toward her new life. "All done, Mrs. Wilson. Your investments are already yielding returns." Augustus handed her all the receipts neatly organized in a folder. "Thank you, Augustus. Your discretion and professionalism were crucial." Margaret shook his hand with sincere gratitude. Leaving the bank, Margaret headed to the real estate agency to finalize the apartment contract. With proof of income in hand, the process was quick and simple. "Mrs. Wilson, it's a pleasure to have you as a tenant." John handed her the apartment keys. "If you need anything, just let me know." By late afternoon, Margaret was in the living room of her new apartment, watching the square through the window. For the first time in 2 days, she allowed herself to relax completely. She had managed to reorganize her life independently and with dignity, but her peace was interrupted by the ring of the phone she had arranged to have installed in the apartment. On the other end, a familiar and unexpected voice. "Mom?" It was Richard, and his voice sounded strange, almost nervous. Margaret hesitated before answering. This would be the first conversation with her son since the eviction. "Hi, Richard." Her voice came out colder than she intended. "Mom, we need to talk." Richard seemed uncomfortable. "About what?" Margaret didn't make an effort to ease the conversation. "About what happened the day before yesterday. I think maybe we were too blunt." Richard chose his words carefully. Margaret almost smiled. Blunt was a very gentle way to describe a humiliating eviction. "Richard, you kicked me out of the house. Your father must be rolling in his grave seeing how you treat the mother who raised you." She couldn't hide the hurt. "Mom, you don't have to be dramatic. We just thought it would be better for everyone if you had more independence." Richard tried to justify. "Independence?" Margaret repeated the word with irony. "It's interesting you say that now. Look, Mom, we were talking here at home and thought maybe we could find a solution that works for everyone." Richard sounded like he was reading from a pre-written script. Margaret knew exactly what was happening. Someone must have commented about her situation in the neighborhood, probably criticizing Richard and Patricia's behavior. Now they were worried about their reputation. "What kind of solution?" Margaret asked, curious to see how far their hypocrisy would go. "Well, we thought you might come back home. Of course, we'd have to set some rules for a harmonious living arrangement," Richard began to explain. "Rules?" Margaret interrupted. "Rules for me to live in the house I built with my own sweat? Mom, the house is ours now. You signed the deed over yourself. But we're willing to accommodate you again." The arrogance in Richard's voice was palpable. Margaret took a deep breath before responding. This was the moment she had anticipated, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon. "Richard, I appreciate the generosity of your offer, but no, thank you." Her voice was calm and firm. "What do you mean, no?" "Mom, you have nowhere to live." Richard sounded genuinely surprised. "Actually, I do. I found a lovely apartment downtown." Margaret didn't hide the satisfaction in her voice. On the other end of the line, complete silence. Richard clearly hadn't expected that answer. "What do you mean you found an apartment? With what money?" The question came out harsher than Richard probably intended. "With my money, Richard." Margaret replied simply. What money, Mom? You don't have enough to pay rent? For an apartment downtown. Richard was starting to sound nervous. Margaret smiled to herself. This would be a delightful revelation, but the timing wasn't quite right yet. I do, son, more than you think. She deliberately left the statement hanging. Mom, are you delusional? Where would you get money to? Richard was interrupted by a voice in the background. Patricia was saying something Margaret couldn't quite make out. Look, Mom, we're coming over to talk in person. Richard suddenly decided. No, you're not. Margaret was firm. If you want to talk to me, schedule a time. I have my life organized now and I don't take unexpected visits. Mom, where are you living? Richard insisted. Somewhere I'm respected and welcome. Margaret replied and hung up. After ending the call, Margaret felt energized. The conversation had confirmed her suspicions. Richard and Patricia weren't remorseful for what they'd done, just worried about the social consequences of their actions. Later that day, Margaret decided to take a walk through the neighborhood where she'd lived for decades. She wanted to see how people would react to seeing her on the street, to sense if her situation had become public gossip. That's when she ran into Carmen at the corner bakery. Margaret, so good to see you. I was worried about you. Carmen hugged her warmly. Where are you staying? I found an apartment downtown. Everything's settled, Margaret replied calmly. But how? You said yesterday you only had some savings. Carmen was confused. Margaret realized it was time to start revealing her true situation, at least partially. Carmen, I didn't tell you the whole truth yesterday. I have more resources than I let on. Margaret chose her words carefully. What do you mean, more resources? Carmen pulled her to a quieter corner of the bakery. I received an inheritance years ago and never told anyone, not even Richard. Margaret decided to share this part of the truth. Carmen's eyes widened. She'd known Margaret for decades and never suspected she had money tucked away. An inheritance from whom? Carmen's curiosity was natural. A distant aunt. She had investments I didn't even know existed. Margaret explained briefly. And you never told Richard? Carmen was still processing the information. No. And now I understand why my gut told me not to. Margaret sighed. If he'd known about the money when he kicked me out, it would have been even more humiliating. Carmen shook her head, understanding the complexity of the situation. So now are you going to tell him? Carmen asked. I don't know yet. Maybe. But if I do, it'll be when and how I choose. Margaret was being honest about her indecision. At that moment, the two women were interrupted by a familiar voice. Mrs. Wilson. It was Mark, Carmen's son, a 45-year-old man who worked as an accountant in the city. Hi, Mark, Margaret greeted him warmly. She had always liked the young man who treated his mother with kindness and respect. I heard what happened to you. What a terrible situation. Mark showed genuine sympathy. Thank you, Mark, but it's all resolved now. Margaret appreciated his concern. If you need any help with legal or financial matters, you can come to me. Mark offered professional assistance. Margaret looked at Mark with renewed interest. An honest and discreet accountant might be exactly what she needed to better organize her new financial situation. Actually, Mark, I might indeed need some advice. Can I schedule a conversation with you? Margaret accepted the offer. Of course, Mrs. Wilson. Anytime you'd like. Mark made himself available. As she walked back to her apartment, Margaret reflected on how things were falling into place. She had a safe home, financial resources, trustworthy people around her. Most importantly, she had complete control over her own life. But she knew the situation with Richard and Patricia was far from over. They wouldn't give up easily, especially if they started suspecting she had more money than they imagined. Margaret decided she needed to speed up the execution of her plan. It wasn't enough to have gained her independence. She wanted Richard and Patricia to fully understand the mistake they had made. The next morning, Margaret scheduled a meeting with Mark at his office. She brought all her investment documents and a specific proposal. Mark, I need your professional services to organize some financial matters. Margaret got straight to the point. Of course, Mrs. Wilson. How can I help you? Mark was professional and attentive. Margaret then explained her complete financial situation, including the $3 million and the investments she had made. Mark listened quietly, occasionally taking notes. "Mrs. Wilson, you have a very considerable estate. Congratulations. It's on your organization." Mark praised her sincerely. "Thank you, but now I need help making some important decisions." Margaret came to the main point. "What kind of decisions?" Mark asked. "I want to arrange some surprises for my son and daughter-in-law. Nothing illegal or harmful, but I want them to understand exactly who they disrespected," Margaret explained with an enigmatic smile. Mark smiled too, realizing Margaret wasn't just a passive victim in this situation. "What do you have in mind?" He leaned forward, intrigued. "First, I want to buy the house next to my old one. It's been on the market for months." Margaret revealed the first part of her plan. "The house next door? Why?" Mark was curious. "To show I can live wherever I want, whenever I want. And so they see every day just how wrong they were about me," Margaret explained with satisfaction. Mark chuckled softly. He was beginning to admire his client's strategy. "And then?" he asked. "Then, I want to make some significant donations to local institutions, in my own name, very publicly." Margaret continued, unveiling her plan. "I see. You want everyone in town to know about your financial situation." Mark understood the goal. "Exactly. I want Richard and Patricia to feel ashamed of how they treated me when everyone finds out who they kicked out of the house." Margaret didn't hide her satisfaction. Mark stayed silent for a moment, considering the proposal. "Mrs. Wilson, legally there's no issue with what you're suggesting, but may I offer some advice?" He extended a suggestion. "Of course I'm listening." Margaret seemed receptive. "How about doing this gradually? First the house purchase, then the donations, then maybe some local investments. That way, the impact will be bigger and longer lasting." Mark proposed a strategic approach. Margaret liked the idea. Mark was right. A gradual impact would be far more effective than revealing everything at once. "Perfect. Let's start with the house. Can you handle the negotiation?" Margaret authorized the first step. "Of course, I'll contact the realtor today." Mark noted the task. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Leaving Mark's office, Margaret felt invigorated. Finally, she was taking active control of the situation instead of just reacting to events. That afternoon, her phone rang again. It was Richard, and this time his voice sounded more urgent. "Mom, I need to know where you're living." He got straight to the point. "Why?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer. "Because rumors are spreading in the neighborhood that I kicked my mother out of the house. It's damaging my reputation." Richard revealed his real concern. Margaret almost laughed. Just as she'd predicted, the issue wasn't remorse or worry. For her, it was about his own image. "And isn't that exactly what you did?" Margaret asked with irony. "Mom, it wasn't like that. We just thought it would be better." Richard started repeating the same justifications. "Richard, stop!" Margaret cut him off. "You and Patricia kicked me out of the house. That's a fact. If it's hurting your reputation, that's your problem." "But Mom, if you come back home, we can fix this whole situation," Richard insisted. "I'm not coming back, Richard, never." Margaret was firm. "Why you can't support yourself alone?" Richard tried practical arguments. "I can, and far better than you think." Margaret let slip a hint. "Mom, stop speaking in riddles. Where did you get money to rent an apartment downtown?" Richard was growing impatient. Margaret decided it was time for the first real demonstration of her new position. "You know that blue house next to ours? Next to your house?" Margaret corrected herself deliberately. "Yeah, so?" Richard replied, not following her point. "I bought it today." Margaret dropped the news like a bomb. Complete silence on the other end. She could almost hear Richard's brain struggling to process the information. "What do you mean you bought it?" Richard finally managed to speak. "I bought the house, in cash. I'll be your neighbor again." Margaret could barely contain the satisfaction in her voice. "That's impossible. You don't have the money to buy a house." Richard sounded in denial. "I do, son. Far more than you ever imagined." Margaret deepened the mystery. What money, Mom? Where did it come from? Richard was clearly desperate for answers. That's my business now, isn't it? You gave up the right to know about my life when you threw me out. Margaret turned his own logic against him. Mom, this doesn't make sense. You're lying. Richard tried to dismiss what he'd heard. I'm not lying, Richard, and you'll find out very soon. Margaret hung up. After the call, she felt better than she had in months. The first piece of her plan was in motion, and Richard's reaction had been exactly what she expected. Desperation, confusion, and denial. Later that day, Mark called with news. Mrs. Wilson, the house negotiation went smoother than we anticipated. The owner was eager to sell and accepted our offer. Mark reported the progress. Excellent. When can we finalize it? Margaret asked. Tomorrow, if you'd like, Mark confirmed. Perfect. And Mark, I want you to discreetly spread the news around town. Let everyone know that Mrs. Margaret Wilson bought the house on St. Joseph Street, Margaret instructed. Understood, I'll take care of it. Mark grasped the strategy. The next morning, Margaret was at the notary's office finalizing the purchase of her new home. It was a delicious irony. She was buying a house just a few feet away from where she had been kicked out, using money Richard and Patricia never dreamed existed. When she left the notary's office with the deed in hand, Margaret headed straight to her new property. It was a two-story house, similar to the one she had lost, but with an even more beautiful garden. As she opened the gate for the first time, as the owner, Margaret noticed a curtain twitch in the window of the neighboring house. Richard or Patricia was watching. She waved cheerfully, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Minutes later, as expected, Richard appeared at the gate. Mom, what's going on here? He looked confused and nervous. I'm getting acquainted with my new house. Do you like it? Margaret replied casually. What do you mean, your new house? Richard stepped into the garden uninvited. I bought it. Now we're neighbors again. Margaret smiled at her son. Mom, this is insane. Where did you get the money to buy a house? Richard was visibly shaken. Margaret looked at her son with a mix of sadness and satisfaction. Sadness because things had come to this point of confrontation. Satisfaction because she was finally showing her true strength. Richard, sit here on the porch. It's time you learned a few things. Margaret gestured to one of the chairs she had already bought for the new house. Richard sat down, clearly anxious and confused. 3 years ago, I received a significant inheritance from a distant aunt. Very significant. Margaret began her revelation. What aunt? Richard asked. Aunt Eunice, your grandfather's sister. You never met her, Margaret explained. And how much was this inheritance? Richard asked hesitantly. $3 million, Margaret said simply. Richard fell silent for a long moment, as if he needed time to process the information. 3 million, he finally repeated. Exactly. Money I invested, which now earns me about $20,000 a month. Margaret completed the revelation. The expression on Richard's face went through several stages. Surprise, disbelief, understanding, and finally something that looked like regret. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me? Richard asked, his voice choked. Because I wanted to see what kind of person you really were, Richard. I wanted to see if you loved and respected me for who I am, not for what I have. Margaret was brutally honest. And I failed the test, Richard muttered. You did, son. You failed. Completely. Margaret confirmed without softening. Richard lowered his head, perhaps understanding for the first time the gravity of what he had done. Mom, if I had known, he began to justify. Known what, Richard? That if you knew I had money, you wouldn't have kicked me out. Margaret interrupted. That only makes it worse. That's not it, Mom. It's just... Richard struggled for words. It's just that you and Patricia treated me like a useless burden. You humiliated me, disrespected me, made me feel like I was worthless. Margaret voiced all the pain she had felt. Richard remained silent, unsure how to respond. Now what? He finally asked. Now you'll find out what it's like to have a millionaire neighbor who owes you nothing. Margaret stood up. Someone who can buy whatever she wants, do whatever she wants without needing your approval. Mom, we can talk and work this out. Richard made one last attempt. There's nothing to work out, Richard. You made your choice when you kicked me out. Now I make mine. Margaret said firmly. Can I tell Patricia about the money? Richard asked. Tell whoever you want. Soon enough the whole town will know. Margaret revealed her plans. That afternoon, Margaret began planning renovations for her new home. It wasn't necessary from a practical standpoint, but it would be a visible way to show off her prosperity to all the neighbors, especially Richard and Patricia. She hired a team of architects and decorators, instructing them to make sure their work would be noticed. An even more beautiful garden, a refreshed facade, high-quality furniture delivered regularly. Over the next week, the activity at Margaret's house caught the attention of the entire neighborhood. Moving trucks, renovation crews, constant deliveries. It was impossible to ignore that something big was happening. Carmen was one of the first to visit. Margaret, what's with all these changes? She asked, amazed at the transformation. I'm just fixing up my new home the way I've always wanted, Margaret replied with satisfaction. But this must be costing a fortune, Carmen remarked. I can afford it, Carmen. I can afford anything I want. Margaret smiled enigmatically. News of Mrs. Wilson's mysterious prosperity began spreading through the neighborhood. Speculations about inheritances, lotteries, secret investments circulated among the neighbors. Richard and Patricia watched everything from their window, clearly unsettled by the situation. With each passing day, it became more obvious that Margaret was not the dependent elderly woman they had imagined. A week after buying the house, Margaret received an unexpected visit. Patricia. Mrs. Wilson, can we talk? Patricia tried to use a respectful tone she had never used before. Of course, Patricia. Come in. Margaret welcomed her into the newly decorated living room. Patricia looked around, visibly impressed by the quality of the furniture and decor. The house looks beautiful, she commented, clearly uncomfortable. Thank you, Margaret was polite but cold. Mrs. Wilson, I came here to try and clear some things up, Patricia began hesitantly. What things? Margaret asked, though she knew exactly where this was going. About what happened last week. Maybe we were hasty. Patricia chose her words carefully. Hasty? Margaret repeated the word with irony. That's an interesting way to describe an eviction. Mrs. Wilson, if we had known about your financial situation, things would have been different, Patricia finally admitted what was really bothering her. Ah, so the problem was me not proving I deserved respect? Margaret confronted her directly. That's not it. Patricia tried to backtrack. That's exactly it, Patricia. You treated me poorly because you thought I had no power to fight back, Margaret said bluntly. Patricia fell silent, unsure how to respond. And now that you've found out I have money, you want to make amends, Margaret continued. Mrs. Wilson, we'd like you to come back home. We can rearrange everything. Patricia made the offer Margaret had expected. No, thank you, Margaret replied immediately. But why? We're family, Patricia insisted. Family? Family kicks me out of my own home? Margaret challenged. Mrs. Wilson, everyone makes mistakes. Patricia tried to downplay it. Some mistakes are unforgivable, Patricia. Margaret stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. Patricia left Margaret's house visibly frustrated. Her attempt at reconciliation had completely failed. That night, Margaret reflected on their talk. As she had predicted, Patricia's motivation was purely financial. There had been no genuine display of remorse or acknowledgement of the mistake made. This confirmed that Margaret was on the right path with her plans. Richard and Patricia needed to understand that their actions had permanent consequences. The next day, Margaret began the second phase of her plan: public donations. She reached out to Mark to organize significant contributions to a few local institutions. I want to donate $50,000 to the municipal nursing home, $50,000 to the children's hospital, and $100,000 to the public library. Margaret detailed her intentions. Excellent idea, Mrs. Wilson, but may I suggest we make this very public? Mark proposed. Exactly what I want. I want the whole city to know. Margaret confirmed. I'll organize donation ceremonies. We can invite the local press. Hold an event for each donation, Mark suggested. Perfect. Margaret approved enthusiastically. The first ceremony was at the municipal nursing home. Margaret arrived elegantly dressed, accompanied by Mark and the institution's director. Some local journalists were present, along with staff and a few family members of the residents. It's with great pleasure that I make this donation to improve the quality of life for the seniors living. Here. Margaret spoke briefly but with emotion. The news appeared in the local paper the next day with a photo of Margaret handing over the check. The headline read, "Retired businesswoman donates $50K to municipal nursing home." The neighborhood's reaction was immediate. Everyone wanted to know more about the mysterious retired businesswoman who had seemingly come into wealth out of nowhere. Margaret received daily visits from curious neighbors, all eager to understand her transformation. She answered their questions politely but without revealing specific details about her fortune. The second ceremony at the Children's Hospital had an even greater impact. This time, in addition to journalists, a few council members attended the event. Mrs. Margaret Wilson is an example of generosity and love for others, the hospital director declared during the ceremony. This time, the photo showed Margaret surrounded by grateful children, a genuine smile on her face. It was clear she was enjoying every moment of public recognition. Richard and Patricia watched the reports on the local news, clearly unsettled by the positive attention Margaret was receiving. "She's doing this on purpose to humiliate us," Patricia remarked to Richard. Maybe she's always been like this and we just never noticed," Richard replied, sounding more thoughtful. "What do you mean always been like this?" "She never showed signs of having so much money," Patricia insisted. "No, but she's always been generous and kind to people. Maybe the money just gave her the power to be who she always was." Richard was beginning to see his mother in a new light. The third and largest ceremony was at the public library. The $100,000 donation drew the attention of the entire community. The mayor was present, along with several local business owners and community leaders. "Education has always been a priority in my life," Margaret declared to the journalists. "It's rewarding to be able to contribute so more people can have access to books and knowledge." During the ceremony, Margaret was introduced as one of the city's leading philanthropists. People she didn't even know came to greet her and thank her for her generosity. It was then that Margaret realized something she hadn't anticipated. She was genuinely enjoying being recognized for her good deeds. It wasn't just about showing her power to Richard and Patricia. It was about finally being able to make a difference in people's lives. After the ceremony, Margaret was approached by several other institutions asking for donations. She promised to consider each request, but asked for time to evaluate her priorities. That night, for the first time since being kicked out of the house, Margaret felt completely fulfilled. She had not only regained her dignity, but also discovered a new purpose for her life. But her satisfaction was interrupted by the phone. It was Richard, and his voice sounded different this time. "Mom, can I come over and talk to you?" he asked humbly. "You can, but alone," Margaret set the condition. "Okay, I'm on my way now," Richard agreed immediately. When Richard arrived, Margaret noticed he seemed different, less arrogant, more reflective. The news about his mother's donations had clearly made an impact. "Mom, I came here to apologize," Richard began without hesitation. "Apologize for..." "What specifically?" Margaret wanted him to say it outright. "For kicking you out of the house, for being rude, for not recognizing everything you've done for me all my life." Richard listed his mistakes. Margaret watched him carefully, trying to gauge if his remorse was genuine. "And why are you apologizing now, Richard?" she asked. "Because I saw in the news the woman you've always been, the one I never appreciated," Richard answered sincerely. "Are you saying you only see me as worthy of respect now?" Margaret pressed. "No, Mom, I mean I only now understand how wrong I was," Richard corrected. Margaret stayed silent for a few minutes, weighing her son's words. "Richard, what you and Patricia did to me can't be undone," she finally said. "I know, Mom, but I can try to make it right," Richard offered. "How?" Margaret asked. "I don't know yet, but I want to try," Richard admitted his uncertainty. Margaret looked at her son with mixed feelings. Part of her wanted to forgive him immediately, but another part knew it would be too easy for him. Richard, I accept your apology, but forgiveness is something earned through actions, not just words. She set her terms. What do you want me to do? Richard asked. I want you to reflect on why you acted that way. I want you to understand that a mother deserves respect, whether she has money or not, Margaret explained. I understand, Mom, Richard said. Do you? Really? Because if you did, you would never have treated me like that, Margaret challenged. Richard fell silent, acknowledging she was right. Mom, can I ask you something? He said after a while. Go ahead, Margaret allowed. Why did you never tell me about the money? Richard asked. Because I wanted to see if you loved me for who I am, not for what I have, Margaret repeated the explanation she had given before. And I failed, Richard admitted. You did, son, but you can still learn. Margaret left the door open. How? Richard asked hopefully. By starting to treat people with respect, whether they have money or not. By valuing relationships for what truly matters, Margaret advised. Richard nodded, seeming genuinely interested in changing. Mom, what about Patricia? Can you forgive her too? He asked about his wife. Patricia will have to come here and speak for herself. I can't forgive someone through a third party. Margaret was firm. She's ashamed, Richard explained. She should be. Margaret didn't soften. But would you give her a chance to explain? Richard insisted. If she comes here with true humility, I'll listen, Margaret conceded. Richard stood up to leave, but stopped at the door. Mom, you were very smart to keep the money a secret, he remarked. It wasn't smartness, Richard. It was sadness. Sadness to discover that my own son would only respect me if he knew I had money, Margaret expressed. Her disappointment. Richard left the house visibly shaken by his mother's words. Margaret, on the other hand, felt relieved to have finally said everything she needed to say. In the following days, Margaret continued receiving visits from people interested in her story. The transformation of an ordinary retiree into a recognized philanthropist had captured the imagination of the entire town. It was during one of these visits that Margaret received an unexpected proposal. The mayor came in person to invite her to join the Municipal Council for Social Development. Mrs. Wilson, your experience and generosity would be invaluable to our work, the mayor explained. The invitation is an honor, Mayor, but may I have some time to think? Margaret asked. Of course, but I hope you'll accept. The town needs people like you, the mayor insisted kindly. After the mayor's visit, Margaret realized her life had taken a completely new direction. It was no longer just about proving her worth to Richard and Patricia. It was about building a positive legacy in the community. That afternoon, Margaret decided to take a walk downtown. She wanted to see how people treated her now, to understand the real impact of her actions. The difference was striking. People who had barely greeted her before now stopped to talk and thank her for her donations. Shopkeepers offered discounts. Children recognized her from TV. Margaret realized she had gained something she'd never had before, genuine public recognition for her personal qualities, not just for being someone's mother or wife. It was during this walk that she ran into Patricia on the street. Her daughter-in-law seemed uncomfortable seeing her, but couldn't avoid the encounter. Mrs. Wilson, Patricia greeted hesitantly. Patricia, Margaret replied cordially. Can I talk to you? Patricia asked nervously. Here on the street, Margaret questioned. Or at your house, if you'll allow it, Patricia suggested. All right, let's go, Margaret agreed. Back at her house, Margaret served coffee to Patricia, who seemed visibly nervous. Mrs. Wilson, I came here to apologize, Patricia began directly. Apologize for what? Margaret wanted to hear Patricia's version, for influencing Richard to make that decision. Patricia tried to downplay her responsibility. Influenced? Margaret repeated the word. Or pressured? Patricia fell silent, realizing Margaret wouldn't be easily fooled. Patricia, be honest with me. Why did you want me out of the house? Margaret asked directly. I thought you were too present, Patricia offered a diplomatic explanation. Present how? Margaret pressed. Always giving opinions on how we should live, always interfering. Patricia began revealing her true feelings. Interfering how? By giving advice when you asked, helping around the house, cooking for you? Margaret listed her contributions. Patricia realized her complaint sounded petty when spoken aloud. Mrs. Wilson, maybe I was unfair, she admitted reluctantly. Maybe? Margaret wouldn't accept the downplay. I was unfair, Patricia corrected. And now? Why are you apologizing now? Margaret asked the central question. Patricia hesitated before answering, clearly torn between honesty and self-preservation. Because I saw I was wrong about you, she opted for a half-truth. Saw where on the TV reports? Margaret was direct. Yes, but not just that. Patricia tried to recover. Patricia, be honest. You're here because you found out I have money, Margaret confronted. It's not just that, Patricia weakly denied. It's mostly that, Margaret insisted. Patricia lowered, her head unable to fully deny it. Mrs. Wilson, I know I made a serious mistake, she finally admitted. You certainly did, but admitting your mistake is only the first step, Margaret replied. What else can I do? Patricia asked. You can start by treating people with respect, regardless of whether they have money or power. Margaret gave the same advice she had given Richard. I will. I'll try to change, Patricia promised. I hope you succeed, Margaret responded, though without much expectation. After Patricia left, Margaret reflected on the conversation. Though her daughter-in-law had apologized, she hadn't shown the same level of sincerity as Richard. Her motivations seemed more calculated, less genuine. But Margaret decided to give her the benefit of the doubt, at least for now. That night, Margaret made an important decision. She would accept the invitation to join the city council. It was time to use her influence and resources to make positive changes in the community. She also decided one more thing. She would not move back in with Richard and Patricia, even if they begged. Her new life was better, more dignified, and more fulfilling than the one before. The next morning, Margaret called the mayor to confirm her participation on the council. The news was met with enthusiasm, and a swearing-in ceremony was scheduled for the following week. The swearing-in ceremony was yet another event that showcased the transformation in Margaret's life. She was introduced as one of the city's most distinguished citizens, someone whose commitment to social welfare was exemplary. During her inauguration speech, Margaret spoke about the importance of valuing all people, regardless of their social or financial status. Every person has worth and deserves respect. Sometimes those we judge as least important are the ones who have the most to offer. Her words carried the weight of personal experience. In the audience, Richard watched with a mix of pride and regret. He was beginning to truly understand who his mother had always been and how wrong he had been about her. Patricia was also present, but her expression was harder to read. She seemed impressed but also calculating, as if assessing how to benefit from Margaret's new position. After the ceremony, Margaret was surrounded by people eager to congratulate her and discuss projects for the city. For the first time in years, she felt truly useful and valued. Richard approached once the crowd thinned. "Mom, I'm so proud of you," he said sincerely. "Thank you, son," Margaret replied, though without her former warmth. "Were you always like this? Did you always care so much about other people?" Richard asked. "Always, Richard. You just never paid attention," Margaret answered sadly. "I know. And I regret that so much," Richard admitted. "Regret is important, but what truly matters is what you do from now on," Margaret advised. In the weeks that followed, Margaret threw herself into her work on the city council. She proposed and passed several initiatives to improve the lives of the city's less fortunate. One of the projects she was most proud of was a vocational training program for seniors. The idea had come from her own experience of feeling undervalued and discarded. Many people think that after 60, we're no longer useful for anything. Margaret explained the project to the other council members. "I want to prove them wrong." The program was an immediate success. Dozens of seniors signed up to learn new skills, from basic computer literacy to advanced crafts. Margaret Wilson personally financed a large part of the program, but insisted that others contribute as well. She wanted it to be a community effort, not just her personal initiative. During one of the program's classes, Margaret was approached by a 70-year-old woman who had learned to use a computer. "Mrs. Wilson, you've changed my life. Now, I can talk to my grandchildren who live far away," the woman said emotionally. Moments like these made Margaret realize her new life had a much greater purpose than simply proving her worth to Richard and Patricia. But the family situation still wasn't fully resolved. Richard had made genuine efforts to change, visiting her regularly and showing real interest in her life and work. Patricia, on the other hand, kept her distance, appearing only at public events where the presence of the influential mother-in-law could benefit her socially. Margaret noticed the difference in their attitudes, but chose not to confront Patricia directly. Some people change genuinely, others just adapt to circumstances. 3 months after her appointment to the board, Margaret received an unexpected call. Her journalist from a regional magazine wanted to write a story about her. "Mrs. Wilson, your transformation from an ordinary retiree to an influential philanthropist caught our attention," the journalist explained. "There was no transformation. I've always been the same person," Margaret corrected. "But you didn't make donations or serve on city councils before," the journalist insisted. "Before I didn't have the resources or the opportunity. But I've always cared about people," Margaret replied. The interview was published under the title, "Mrs. Wilson's Second Chance: How an Unexpected Inheritance Revealed a Retiree's Generous Heart." The story had a positive impact across the region. Margaret received letters from people in other cities congratulating her on her social work and asking for advice on how to develop similar projects. That's when she realized her influence was growing beyond her town. Other communities wanted to replicate her projects, and other city councils sought her guidance. But Margaret was careful not to let fame go to her head. Through her experience with Richard and Patricia, she had learned that external recognition doesn't always reflect a person's true worth. 6 months after being kicked out of her home, Margaret was living a life she'd never imagined possible. She had financial independence, social recognition, a clear purpose, and relationships based on mutual respect. Most importantly, she had inner peace. Gone was the constant anxiety of trying to please people who didn't value her. Gone was the humiliation of being treated like a burden. Richard was gradually rebuilding his relationship with his mother. His visits became more frequent and genuine, showing real interest in her work and starting to appreciate her wisdom and experience. "Mom, can I confess something?" Richard asked during one of his visits. "Of course," Margaret replied. "I always thought I understood you, but now I realize I never really took the time to know you," he admitted. "That's true, Richard. You only saw me as your mother, not as Margaret Wilson, the person," she agreed. "Can I try to get to know Margaret Wilson now?" Richard asked humbly. "Yes, you can, son," Margaret smiled, feeling she finally had her son back, but in a new and better way. Patricia, however, still kept a respectful but calculated distance. She was polite and cordial, but Margaret could tell the change in attitude was superficial, driven by circumstances rather than genuine transformation. Margaret decided not to let it bother her. Some people are capable of real growth and change, while others simply adapt to what's convenient. She had learned to accept people's limitations without letting them affect her. 1 year after being expelled, Margaret was invited to be the keynote speaker at the graduation ceremony for the first class of the senior training program she had created. "A year ago, I myself discovered it's never too late to start over," she told the audience of graduates and their families. "Each of you has proven that age is just a number when you have determination and support." In the audience, 23 seniors between 60 and 80 years old held their certificates with pride. Some had learned computer skills, others crafts, and some had even started small businesses. "You didn't just learn new skills," Margaret continued her speech. "You showed your families and society that you still have so much to contribute." After the ceremony, Margaret was approached by one of her students, Mrs. Mary, a 75-year-old woman. "Mrs. Wilson, you saved my life," Mary said emotionally. "How so, Mary?" Margaret asked. "My children also thought I was no longer good for anything. They wanted to put me in a nursing home," Mary explained. "But when they saw I learned to use a computer and started selling my embroidery online, they completely changed their minds. Margaret hugged Mary, understanding exactly what she had been through. Her story echoed Margaret's own experience with Richard and Patricia. "You saved yourself, Mary. I just provided the opportunity," Margaret replied humbly. "But without the opportunity, I would have never discovered I could still surprise everyone," Mary insisted. Conversations like this confirmed to Margaret that she had found her true purpose in life. It wasn't just about money or recognition, it was about using her resources and influence to empower others who felt undervalued. 2 months after the graduation ceremony, Margaret received an unexpected visit. Richard and Patricia together, and they seemed to have something important to say. "Mom, we wanted to talk to you about something," Richard began, sounding nervous. "I'm listening," Margaret said, intrigued. "We were thinking, maybe it's time to give the house back to you," Patricia said, surprising Margaret. "Give the house back," Margaret repeated, not expecting this offer. "Yeah, Mom, we realized it was unfair to take the house from you. We want to make things right," Richard explained. Margaret stayed silent for a moment, processing the proposal. A year ago, getting her house back would have been all she wanted. Now the situation was far more complicated. "Why do you want to do this now?" she asked. "Because it's the right thing to do," Richard answered. But Margaret sensed there was more to it. "And also because we bought a bigger house in another neighborhood," Patricia added, revealing part of the truth. Margaret smiled inwardly. They had likely bought a better house with the resources they gained, after no longer having the expense of caring for her, and now they could afford to be generous by returning the original property. "I appreciate the offer," Margaret said, diplomatically, "but I don't want the house back." "What do you mean you don't want it?" Patricia asked, visibly surprised. "This house here is perfect for me, and that house has memories I'd rather leave in the past," Margaret explained. "But Mom, it's the house you built with Dad," Richard appealed to her emotions. "It was, but now it's the house I was kicked out of by my own son," Margaret replied calmly. Richard lowered his head, remembering the shame of that moment. "Mom, how can we make this right?" he asked. "You can't make it right, Richard. You can only learn from the mistake and not repeat it with others," Margaret answered. "But there must be something we can do," Patricia insisted. Margaret thought for a moment before responding. "There is. You could donate the House to the Senior training program. Turn it into a permanent center for learning and community," she suggested. Richard and Patricia exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this proposal. "Donate the house?" Patricia repeated. "Yes, that way it would serve a noble purpose instead of just being property," Margaret explained. "But Mom, it's a valuable house," Richard began to object. "And didn't you two buy an even better house?" since Margaret challenged. Richard fell silent, realizing the contradiction in his own words. Let's think about it," Patricia said, clearly reluctant. "Of course, take your time," Margaret replied calmly. After they left, Margaret reflected on the conversation. The idea of giving back the house had been interesting, but she had discovered something important. She no longer needed that house to feel at home. Her real home was now where she was respected, valued, and could be herself without asking for permission. It was in that apartment, in the city council, in the social projects she developed. A week later, Richard returned alone. "Mom, we talked about your suggestion," he said. "And?" Margaret asked. "We decided to go through with the donation. We'll transfer the house to the training program," Richard announced. Margaret was genuinely surprised. She hadn't expected them to accept her proposal. "Really?" she asked. "Really?" Patricia wasn't too happy at first, but I explained it's the least we can do to start making up for our mistake, Richard explained. "I'm proud of you, Richard," Margaret said, and for the first time in a long while, she meant it. "Can you forgive us now?" Richard asked hopefully. Margaret looked at her son with affection but also realism. "Richard, I forgive you for what you did, but forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, nor does it mean our relationship will go back to how it was before," she explained. "I understand, Mom." Richard nodded. "Our relationship now will be based on mutual respect and honesty. No more family obligations or unspoken expectations." Margaret laid out the new terms. "I accept those conditions." Richard agreed. "Then, we can rebuild our relationship little by little in due time." Margaret smiled at her son. The donation of the house was finalized the following month, with a ceremony that brought the whole community together. The house where Margaret had once been humiliated would now become a place of empowerment for other seniors. During the ceremony, Margaret gave a speech that summed up her journey. "This house has witnessed moments of joy and moments of pain. Now it will have the chance to witness moments of discovery and growth," she said, looking at the house that no longer stirred any longing in her. "Everyone who walks through these doors should know they are valued, respected, and have something important to contribute," Margaret continued, "because every person, no matter their age, deserves dignity and recognition." In the audience, many were moved to tears. Margaret's story had touched the entire community, not just because she had found her strength, but because it showed that it was possible to start over and find purpose at any stage of life. Richard watched his mother's speech with a mix of pride and regret. He was beginning to truly understand who his mother had always been, and how much time he'd lost by not seeing it sooner. Patricia was also there, but her expression was more reserved. She had agreed to the donation, but Margaret could tell she hadn't undergone the same inner transformation as Richard. After the ceremony, Margaret was approached by dozens of people wanting to thank her, ask about new projects, or simply chat. She felt truly useful and connected to her community. That night, alone in her apartment, Margaret looked out the window at the square and reflected on her journey. 2 years ago, she was a retired widow living quietly in her son's home. Today, she was one of the most respected and influential citizens in town. But what made her proudest wasn't the public recognition or even the financial resources. It was discovering she could be the author of her own story, rather than just a supporting character in someone else's. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Carmen, the neighbor who had been her first ally during the crisis. "Margaret, I saw the ceremony on TV. What a beautiful speech," Carmen praised. "Thank you, Carmen, and thank you for supporting me when I needed it most," Margaret replied sincerely. "I'm the one who should be thanking you. Your friendship taught me so much about courage and dignity." Carmen answered. "I'm glad our friendship is still strong," Margaret said happily. "Always, Margaret, always," Carmen confirmed. In the following months, Margaret threw herself into the new training center. The house that had been her home for 40 years was renovated and adapted to accommodate larger classes and offer more courses. The project grew beyond initial expectations. In addition to training courses, the center provided lectures on seniors' rights, support groups, adapted physical activities, and even a mentorship program where experienced seniors helped others. Margaret funded most of the project, but made sure to seek partnerships with local businesses and other institutions. She wanted the center to be sustainable and not rely solely on her personal contribution. 6 months after the center's opening, Margaret received a surprising call. It was the state governor wanting to see the project in person. "Mrs. Wilson, the results of your center have come to my attention. I'd like to visit and discuss the possibility of replicating the model in other cities," the governor explained. Margaret was flattered by the interest, but also cautious. Her experience had taught her to question the motives behind praise. "It would be a pleasure to host you, Governor. But I want to be clear that my interest is purely social, not political." She set her terms from the start. "Perfect. That's exactly the kind of civic initiative our state needs," the governor replied. The governor's visit brought even more visibility to Margaret's work. State TV journalists covered the event, and her story gained attention across a much wider area. But Margaret stayed focused on her original goals. She didn't let fame or political opportunities distract her. Her commitment remained with those who felt undervalued and forgotten. During the visit, the governor made an unexpected proposal. "Mrs. Wilson, I'd like to invite you to lead a statewide program for senior empowerment," he offered. "That's an interesting proposal, Governor, but I'd need assurances it would be a genuine program, not just political marketing." Margaret responded frankly. "You'd have full autonomy to develop the program as you see fit." the governor assured. Margaret asked for time to consider. It was a chance to expand her impact, but it also risked entangling her in politics she'd rather avoid. After consulting with Mark, her accountant and advisor, and other trusted friends, she decided to accept, but with specific conditions. I accept coordinating the program, but with complete technical independence and the guarantee that it won't be used for electoral purposes. She laid out her conditions. I accept all your terms, the governor agreed. Margaret Wilson's appointment as the state coordinator for the Senior Citizen Empowerment Program was announced at an official ceremony. She was nervous but also excited about the possibility of helping people across the state. Richard was present at the ceremony, radiating pride for his mother. His transformation had been remarkable. The man who had kicked his mother out of the house 2 years earlier was now publicly boasting about being her son. "Mum, I'm so proud of you," he said after the ceremony. "Thank you, son," Margaret replied, feeling she finally had a healthy relationship with Richard. "Will you accept our help with the new program?" Richard asked. "If it's genuine help, yes, but I don't want favoritism or nepotism." Margaret was clear about her expectations. "Understood. I just want to contribute because I believe in the work you're doing," Richard assured her. Patricia was also at the ceremony but maintained her usual reserved demeanor. She greeted Margaret politely but without the genuine enthusiasm Richard showed. Margaret no longer let Patricia's attitude bother her. She had learned that not everyone is capable of deep change, and that was no longer her responsibility. The state program began 3 months later, with training centers opening in 12 cities across the state. Margaret traveled constantly, overseeing implementation and training local coordinators. During one of these trips, she received a letter that moved her deeply. It was from an 80-year-old woman in a small town who had taken one of the first courses. "Dear Margaret, I'm 80 years old and thought my life was over when my son told me I was a burden. But after your course, I learned to use the internet and started selling my homemade sweets online. Now my son asks me for sales advice. You gave me back my dignity." Letters like this arrived weekly from all over the state. Margaret kept them carefully, as they were the true measure of her work's success. A year and a half after taking on the state coordination, Margaret was invited to a national conference on active aging, an opportunity to share her experience with people across the country. During her speech, she publicly shared her own story for the first time. 3 years ago, I was just a retired widow who had been kicked out of her own home by her son, she began, stirring emotion in the audience. Today, I coordinate a program that has impacted the lives of over 5,000 seniors in our state. It wasn't my money that made the difference. It was realizing I had value regardless of any external circumstances. Margaret's speech received the loudest applause at the conference. Many approached her afterward, eager to learn more about the programs she had developed. Most importantly, she earned recognition from fellow professionals working with seniors, validating that her approach was not only effective, but replicable. Returning home after the conference, Margaret felt fulfilled in a way she never had before. It wasn't just about personal or professional success, it was about finding her true purpose in life. Richard was waiting for her at the airport, something he had never done before. His transformation from a neglectful son to a devoted one had been gradual but steady. "How was the conference, Mum?" he asked with genuine interest. "It was very rewarding. I met people doing similar work all over the country." Margaret responded, appreciating his interest. "Are you happy with your new life?" Richard asked a more personal question. Margaret looked at her son and smiled. "I'm very happy, Richard, happier than I've been in many years." She answered honestly. "Can I confess something?" Richard asked. "Of course," Margaret permitted. "Sometimes I wonder how things would be if we had never gone through that situation," he said hesitantly. "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "If I hadn't kicked you out of the house, maybe you would have never discovered all this strength you have." Richard explained his thought. Margaret reflected on the observation before answering. "It's possible, Richard, but I'd rather think the strength was always there. The circumstances just gave me the chance to discover it and use it," she replied. "Either way, I deeply regret what I did," Richard reaffirmed. "I know, son. and your change in attitude proves you've learned. Margaret acknowledged his growth. Can I ask you something about Patricia? Richard changed the subject. You may. Margaret allowed. Do you think she's really changed? Richard asked, showing he also noticed the difference between his own transformation and his wife's. Margaret chose her words carefully before answering. I think Patricia has adapted to the new situation. That's different from genuinely changing, she said diplomatically. And does that bother you? Richard asked. Not anymore. I've learned I can't control how others choose to live or relate to me. I can only choose how I respond to them. Margaret explained her philosophy. In the following months, the state program continued growing and gaining recognition. Margaret was invited to advise other states interested in replicating the model. She accepted some of these consulting roles, but always made sure not to overextend herself. She had learned to value her time and personal well-being. During one of these consulting trips, Margaret met Charles, a 74-year-old widower, who coordinated a similar program in another state. They developed a friendship based on shared interests and values. Charles visited her a few times, and Margaret began considering the possibility of having a companion at this stage of life. It wasn't urgent or necessary, but it was a pleasant thought. Margaret, may I ask you a personal question? Charles requested during one of his visits. Of course, she permitted. Have you ever thought about remarrying? He asked directly. Margaret smiled at the question. I have, yes, but it would be a very careful decision. I never want to be in a situation again where I depend on someone else's approval to feel valued, she answered honestly. I understand completely. I've also had experiences that taught me to value my independence, Charles shared. Then perhaps we could think of a partnership between independent people who choose to be together. Margaret suggested. That would be perfect. Charles smiled. The friendship between Margaret and Charles naturally evolved into a mature and respectful relationship. They felt no rush or pressure, simply enjoying each other's company. When possible, Richard was happy to hear about his mother's relationship. Mom, I'm glad you found someone special, he said sincerely. Thank you, son. Charles is a very good man, Margaret replied. When will we meet him officially? Richard asked. When the time is right. There's no rush, Margaret answered, showing she had learned not to force situations. 2.5 years after being kicked out of her home, Margaret was living a life that surpassed her most optimistic dreams. She had self-love, professional purpose, social recognition, financial independence, and even the possibility of a new love. Most importantly, she was certain she had achieved all of this by being authentically herself, without having to pretend to be someone she wasn't to please others. On a quiet afternoon, while working in her home office, Margaret received an unexpected call. It was Patricia, and her voice sounded different. Mrs. Wilson, may I speak with you? Patricia asked. Of course, Patricia, Margaret replied, intrigued. It's about Richard, Patricia said, and Margaret noticed concern in her voice. What happened? Margaret asked, growing alert. He's questioning our relationship, Patricia revealed. Margaret was surprised. She hadn't expected Patricia to come to her with marital problems. Questioning how? Margaret asked. He says he's changed a lot since that situation with you. He says I haven't changed along with him, Patricia explained. Margaret began to understand what was happening. Richard's transformation had been genuine and profound, while Patricia had only adapted superficially. That would inevitably create tension in their relationship. And do you think he's right? Margaret asked directly. Patricia was silent for a moment before answering. Maybe, she admitted reluctantly. Patricia, why are you telling me this? Margaret asked, curious about her motives. Because you're the only one who can understand the situation, and maybe you can help me figure out how to really change, Patricia said, with a vulnerability Margaret had never seen in her before. Margaret was moved by Patricia's honesty, even if it was late. Patricia, real change doesn't happen because of outside pressure or to save a relationship. It happens when we genuinely recognize our mistakes and want to be better people, Margaret explained. How can I do that? Patricia asked. Start by acknowledging specifically what you did wrong, why you did it, and how you can act differently in the future, Margaret guided her. I can start by admitting I treated you very badly, that I influenced Richard negatively, and that I did it out of jealousy and insecurity, Patricia began her reflection. Margaret was surprised by the honesty in her answer. That's a good start. And why do you think you acted that way? Margaret asked. Because I felt threatened by the influence you had over Richard. I thought he would always put you first, Patricia admitted. And now, Margaret asked, now I understand that a man who respects and loves his mother will likely be a better husband, not worse, Patricia said, showing real understanding. Margaret felt hopeful that Patricia was finally undergoing a genuine transformation. Patricia, I appreciate your honesty, but you need to discuss these things with Richard, not me, Margaret advised. I know, but I wanted to make sure I truly understood my mistakes first, Patricia explained. And do you? Margaret asked. I think so. And I want to try to be a better person, not just to save my marriage, but because it's the right thing to do, Patricia said sincerely. Margaret was pleased to see Patricia finally showing the capacity for real change. Then talk to Richard. Be as honest with him as you were with me just now, Margaret advised. I will. And Mrs. Wilson, thank you for listening to me, Patricia said gratefully. You're welcome, Patricia, Margaret replied. After the conversation, Margaret reflected on how things had evolved. There was a real possibility that, at last, the whole family could find a new balance based on mutual respect and honesty. A week later, Richard visited her to talk about his conversation with Patricia. Mum, Patricia talked to me about everything. For the first time, I felt she truly understood what happened, Richard reported. And how do you feel about that? Margaret asked. Hopeful. For the first time in a long while, I think we can have a real relationship, Richard answered. I'm happy for you, Margaret said sincerely. Mum, can I ask you something? Richard inquired. Of course, Margaret allowed. Patricia would like to come here and apologize properly, not the shallow apologies from before, but a real request for forgiveness, Richard explained. She can come whenever she wants, Margaret agreed. 2 days later, Patricia showed up at Margaret's door alone and visibly nervous. Mrs. Wilson, I came here to ask for your forgiveness, she began directly. I'm listening, Margaret said, inviting her to sit. I want to apologize for influencing Richard to kick you out of the house, for treating you with disrespect, for being driven by jealousy and insecurity instead of trying to understand your place in the family, Patricia listed specifically. Margaret listened carefully, noticing that this time Patricia's words sounded genuine. I also want to apologize for not realizing sooner that my behavior was wrong, for taking so long to understand that you weren't a threat but an example, Patricia continued. Thank you for your words, Patricia, Margaret replied. Can you forgive me? Patricia asked directly. Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law and saw for the first time real vulnerability and sincere remorse. Yes, Patricia, I forgive you, Margaret said honestly. Patricia began to cry, clearly relieved. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson, she said through tears. But just as I told Richard, forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or that things will go back to how they were, Margaret clarified. I understand. I just want the chance to build a better relationship between... Thus, Patricia requested. Then let's build it little by little based on mutual respect, Margaret agreed. In the months that followed, Margaret noticed a real change in Patricia's behavior. She made an effort to be more respectful, more considerate, and more genuine in their interactions. Their relationship still wasn't as close as Margaret had once had with Richard before the troubles, but it was honest and respectful. For Margaret, that was enough. 3 years after being forced out of her home, Margaret was celebrating the 3rd anniversary of the training center at a party that brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been changed by the programs she had developed. During the event, Margaret was surprised with a special tribute. Program participants had prepared a video with testimonials from people across the state thanking her for her work. Mrs. Wilson taught us that age is just a number when you have purpose, said a 75-year-old woman in the video. Thanks to Mrs. Wilson's programs, I've learned I can start over as many times as I need to, declared an 80-year-old man. Margaret watched the video with tears in her eyes, moved by the impact her work had made on so many lives. Richard and Patricia were at the party, and Margaret noticed how they interacted more harmoniously and respectfully. Apparently, the crisis in their relationship had led to real growth for both of them. Charles was also there, and Margaret felt grateful to have found a partner who shared her values and supported her work. During her thank you speech, Margaret reflected on her journey. 3 years ago, I thought my life was over. I discovered it was actually just beginning, she told the audience. Every person here proves it's never too late to discover our worth, our purpose, and our ability to make a difference, Margaret continued. It wasn't the money that changed my life. It was realizing that I always had worth, always had strength, always had so much to offer. The money just gave me the resources to show it, she explained. The party lasted well into the night, with people sharing their own stories of transformation and new beginnings. Margaret moved among the guests, listening to each story, celebrating every achievement. That night, when she finally got home, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair and looked around her apartment. On the walls were photos of the projects she had developed, certificates of recognition, thank you letters from people she had helped. But what made her proudest was knowing she had built a life based on her own merits, her own values, and her own choices. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Richard. "Mom, how are you feeling after the party?" he asked warmly. "I'm feeling very grateful, son," Margaret replied. "Grateful for what?" Richard asked. "For discovering I'm much stronger than I thought. For finding my purpose. For having people who love and respect me for who I am," Margaret listed. "Mom, can I say something?" Richard asked. "Of course," Margaret allowed. "You're the bravest person I know," Richard said with admiration. "Why do you say that?" Margaret asked. "Because you lost everything, and instead of letting it break, you used it as an opportunity to build something even better," Richard explained. Margaret smiled, appreciating her son's acknowledgement. "I didn't lose everything, Richard. I realized you can never lose what truly matters. Your dignity, your ability to love, and your inner strength," she corrected. "You're right, and thank you for teaching me that," Richard said gratefully. After hanging up, Margaret got ready for bed. Tomorrow would be another day full of possibilities, new projects, new chances to make a difference. Before falling asleep, she thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago. Insecure, dependent, seeking approval. And the woman she was now, confident, independent, giving worth instead of searching for it. The transformation had been painful, but necessary. And most importantly, it had been permanent. Margaret knew she would never again be the person who allowed herself to be disrespected or undervalued. In the following months, Margaret received an offer that made her reflect on the future, an invitation to write a book about her experience and the programs she had developed. "Your story could inspire millions," the editor who approached her said. Margaret considered the proposal carefully. On one hand, sharing her experience could truly help others. On the other, she had always been a private person. After talking with Charles, Richard, and her closest friends, Margaret decided to take on the challenge of writing the book. The writing process was therapeutic and revealing. Revisiting her journey through writing helped her understand her own motivations and transformations even better. The book was released a year later with the title, "It's Never Too Late to Start Over." The story of a woman who found her strength at 72 sex. The launch was an event that drew hundreds of people. Margaret felt nervous seeing the crowd gathered to hear her speak about her life. "I wrote this book not because my story is extraordinary, but because it's common," she said during the launch. "Millions of people, especially seniors, go through similar situations every day. The difference isn't in the circumstances, but in how we choose to respond to them," Margaret continued. The book was well received, especially among those who had experienced being undervalued or disrespected by family. Margaret received hundreds of letters from readers sharing their own stories. One of the letters that moved her the most was from a 65-year-old woman who wrote, "Mrs. Margaret, your book gave me the courage to leave an abusive relationship. I discovered I have worth even without anyone's approval." Letters like this confirmed for Margaret that she had made the right decision in sharing her story publicly. 4 years after being kicked out of her home, Margaret was living a life that surpassed all her expectations. She had a healthy relationship with Richard, a respectful coexistence with Patricia, a loving partner in Charles, and a job that deeply fulfilled her. Most importantly, she was absolutely certain of her own worth and would never again allow anyone to make her feel less than she deserved. On a sunny morning, while having coffee on her porch, Margaret received a surprising phone call. It was the mayor of a neighboring town, telling her about a situation that had come to his attention. "Mrs. Wilson, we have a 78-year-old woman here who was kicked out of her home by her children. When people in town heard about your story, they suggested I reach out to you," the mayor explained. Margaret felt a pang of sadness hearing about someone else going through the same ordeal she had faced. "How can I help?" she asked. "Could you come here and talk to her? Maybe your experience could help her find a way forward," the mayor requested. "Of course, I can come tomorrow," Margaret agreed immediately. The next day, Margaret traveled to the neighboring town and was taken to the house where the elderly woman was temporarily staying with kind neighbors. "Mrs. Antonia, this is Mrs. Wilson, the woman we spoke about," the mayor introduced them. Mrs. Antonia was a small, frail woman with red eyes from crying. Margaret immediately recognized in her expression the same despair she had felt years ago. "Mrs. Antonia, I know exactly how you're feeling," Margaret began, sitting beside her. "You've been through this?" Antonia asked in a trembling voice. "I have. 4 years ago, my own son kicked me out of my home," Margaret shared. "And how did you manage to overcome it?" Antonia asked hopefully. Margaret spent the next 2 hours telling her story to Mrs. Antonia, explaining not just what had happened, but especially how she had discovered her inner strength and rebuilt her life. "Do you have any financial resources?" Margaret asked, wanting to understand Antonia's specific situation. "Just my pension. It's not much, but maybe enough to rent a small room," Antonia replied. Margaret quickly thought of practical ways she could help immediately. "Mrs. Antonia, I'll help. You find decent housing, and if you'd like, you can join our training programs," she offered. "You'd do that for me? But you don't even know me." Antonia was moved. "I do it because I know everyone deserves dignity and respect, no matter their age," Margaret explained. In the following days, Margaret helped Mrs. Antonia find a small but comfortable apartment, furnish it with the basics, and enroll in available social programs. Most importantly, she spent time talking with Antonia, helping her rebuild her self-esteem and recognize her own worth. "Mrs. Wilson, how can I repay such kindness?" Antonia asked. "By helping others who go through the same thing," Margaret replied. "When you feel strong enough, share your story with people who need hope." The experience with Mrs. Antonia gave Margaret a new idea. She decided to create a support network for elderly people in vulnerable family situations, connecting those who had overcome similar challenges with those still struggling. "Charles, what do you think about expanding our work to include support for elderly people rejected by their families?" Margaret proposed to her companion. "I think it's an excellent idea. Your personal experience would give the project a lot of credibility," Charles enthusiastically agreed. The support network was launched 6 months later with trained volunteers in several cities. Margaret personally supervised the training, ensuring the volunteers understood both the practical and emotional aspects of the necessary support. The project grew quickly, serving dozens of cases each month. Margaret received regular reports about people rebuilding their lives with dignity after being rejected by their families. One case that particularly filled her with pride was an 85-year-old man who, after being thrown out by his children, discovered a talent for painting and began selling his work, achieving financial independence and artistic recognition. "Every story like this proves that our age doesn't define our possibilities," Margaret remarked to Charles after reading the report. "You're changing how society views aging," Charles observed. "I'm not changing anything. I'm just showing what has always been true, that elderly people have value, capability, and deserve respect," Margaret corrected modestly. 5 years after being cast out of her home, Margaret was invited to receive a municipal honor for her social work. The ceremony would take place at the city's main theater, attended by officials and community leaders. During the ceremony, as she listened to the speech about her contributions to society, Margaret reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. From a woman who felt discarded and worthless, she had become someone recognized for making a difference in thousands of lives. When it was her turn to speak, Margaret looked out at the audience and saw familiar faces: Richard and Patricia, Charles, Carmen, Mark, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by her work. 5 years ago, I was a woman who believed her life was over, she began. Today, I know it had only just begun. I didn't receive this honor for being special or exceptional. I received it for doing what anyone with resources and opportunity should do: help others discover their own worth. Every person in this audience has the power to transform not just their own life, but also the lives of others. The question isn't whether we have that power, but whether we choose to use it, she challenged them. I invite all of you to look around and see how many people just need an opportunity, a little support, someone who believes in their potential, Margaret concluded. Her speech received a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. She was moved not just by the recognition, but by knowing her message had resonated with those present. After the ceremony, Margaret was surrounded by people eager to congratulate her and discuss ways to contribute to her projects. The energy and enthusiasm of the community made her realize her work had sparked a movement far greater than she had anticipated. Richard approached as the crowd thinned. "Mom, I'm so proud of you," he said, as he had many times in recent years. "Thank you, son," Margaret replied. "Can I confess something?" Richard asked. "Of course," she allowed. "Sometimes I feel ashamed when people find out I'm your son," he admitted, surprising her. "Why?" she asked, concerned. "Because they know I'm the one who threw out of the house the woman who's doing so much good for society," Richard explained. Margaret looked at her son with understanding. "Richard, your greatest merit isn't being my son. It's about recognizing your mistake, genuinely changing and becoming a better person," she reassured him. "Do you think people can forgive me?" Richard asked. "They already have, my son. You just need to forgive yourself," Margaret advised. In the months following the honorary ceremony, Margaret continued expanding her projects, but also began thinking about ensuring the work would continue even when she could no longer lead it actively. She started training a new generation of leaders, including people who had benefited from the programs and now wanted to help others. The sustainability of the projects became a top priority. Charles, who had become her partner not just personally, but also professionally, took on increasing administrative responsibilities, allowing Margaret to focus on developing new programs. "Margaret, you need to start delegating more responsibilities," Charles advised during one of their planning meetings. "I know. It's hard to let go of something you built with so much care," Margaret admitted. "But it's precisely because you built it with care that you want to ensure it keeps thriving," Charles reasoned. Margaret knew he was right. She gradually began transferring more responsibilities to the team she had trained, stepping into a strategic advisory role rather than an operational one. The delegation process made her realize something important. She hadn't just created programs, but a work philosophy and methodology that others could replicate. Her legacy was secure. 6 years after being kicked out of her home, Margaret decided to do something she had never considered before: take a real vacation. Not a work trip or a conference, but an actual break to rest and enjoy life. She and Charles planned a month-long trip to explore different regions of the country, with no professional obligations, just time to enjoy each other's company and the freedom of having no responsibilities. "How long has it been since you took a real vacation?" Charles asked as they planned the trip. "Decades. Even when I was married, our trips always had some practical purpose," Margaret realized. "Then it's time to learn how to simply enjoy life," Charles smiled. The trip was eye-opening for Margaret. She discovered she could truly relax, that she didn't need to constantly produce or help someone to feel valuable. One evening on a quiet beach, watching the sunset with Charles, Margaret reflected on her journey. "You know, Charles, I think I finally understand what it means to be at peace with myself," she shared. "How so?" he asked. "For decades, I defined myself by what I did for others. I was a wife, a mother, a caretaker. When I was kicked out, I had to discover who I was beyond those roles," Margaret explained. "And what did you find?" Charles asked. "I found that I'm Margaret, Simply Margaret. And that's enough, she replied calmly. The trip marked a new chapter in Margaret's life. She returned home refreshed, with an even more balanced perspective on work, relationships, and personal life. Back to her activities, she implemented changes reflecting her new philosophy, setting fixed work hours, reserving time for personal activities, and creating a more balanced routine. But this piece would soon be tested when Margaret received an unexpected call that would change the course of events once again. It was from a social worker in another city, reporting a situation that painfully echoed her own experience. "Mrs. Wilson, we have a very delicate situation here. An 80-year-old woman was kicked out of her home by her children, but there are additional complications." The social worker explained urgently in her voice. "What kind of complications?" Margaret asked, already mentally preparing herself to help. "The woman in question has health issues, and her children claim they can't take care of her. But we've discovered they're trying to sell her house while she's temporarily hospitalized." The social worker revealed the gravity of the situation. Margaret felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. It was an even crueler version of what she had gone through. "What's the woman's name?" Margaret asked. "Josephine Sanders. She keeps mentioning she wants to talk to that lady who went through the same thing and became important," the social worker explained. "I'm on my way. Send me the address." Margaret decided immediately. "Mrs. Wilson, I should warn you that the situation is more complicated. Mrs. Sanders's children are influential people in town. One is a lawyer, the other a doctor. They have connections that make our intervention difficult," the social worker cautioned. Margaret paused for a moment. For the first time since she'd begun her social work, she would face a situation where the antagonists had power and resources similar to her own. "That doesn't intimidate me. I'm going anyway." Margaret stood by her decision. 2 hours later, Margaret was at the hospital in the neighboring town speaking with Mrs. Sanders. The elderly woman was visibly frail, but her eyes shone with a familiar determination. "Are you Margaret Wilson?" Josephine asked in a weak but hopeful voice. "Yes, Mrs. Sanders, I'm here to help you." Margaret sat beside the bed. "My children say they can't take care of me anymore, that it's better for me to go to a nursing home," Josephine began, tears streaming down her face. "And do you want to go to a nursing home?" Margaret asked. "No, I want to stay in my house. I built it with my late husband. Every corner holds a memory," Josephine replied vehemently. "Tell me everything that's happened from the beginning," Margaret requested patiently. Over the next hour, Josephine recounted a story that mixed familiar elements with new horrors. Her 2 sons, Dr. Robert and Dr. Michael, had decided she was a burden to their professional careers. "They say they can't see patients at home anymore because I get in the way with my needs," Josephine explained. "What needs? Do you require special care?" Margaret asked. "I use a cane to walk and sometimes forget things. But I still cook, clean, take care of the house." Josephine defended her independence. Margaret began to understand that Josephine's situation was even more unjust than her own had been. The elderly woman wasn't being pushed out for financial or space reasons, but simply because she inconvenienced her son's professional image. "Mrs. Sanders, do you have your own resources?" Margaret asked. "I have my pension and some savings. I'm not as well off as you, but I'm not financially dependent on them," Josephine answered. "Then why do they want you in a nursing home?" Margaret pressed. "So they can sell my house and use the money to invest in their clinics." Josephine revealed the real reason. Margaret felt a wave of outrage. It was an even more calculated and cruel version of what Richard and Patricia had done to her. "Mrs. Sanders, I'll help you out of this situation, but I need you to trust me completely." Margaret made a promise. "I trust you, Mrs. Wilson. You're my only hope." Josephine grasped Margaret's hand tightly. Margaret left the hospital determined to confront Dr. Robert and Dr. Michael. But first, she needed to better understand the power dynamics in town and develop the right strategy. She sought out the social worker who had initially contacted her. "I need to know more about Mrs. Sanders's sons. Tell me everything you know about them." Margaret Wilson asked for detailed information. "Dr. Robert has a highly regarded private practice. Dr. Michael is a cardiologist at the main hospital. Both have excellent professional reputations, but there are rumors in town about how they treat their mother, the social worker reported. What kind of rumors? Margaret asked. That they're ashamed of her for being a simple woman, that they avoid being seen with her in public, that they'd prefer if she just disappeared. The social worker hesitated before finishing. Margaret felt her determination grow stronger. She knew all too well the pain of being treated as a burden by one's own children. I want to schedule a meeting with them, officially as the state coordinator of the Elderly Rights Program. Margaret decided to use her official position. Do you think they'll agree? The social worker asked. They will. People like them can't refuse an official meeting without damaging their reputations. Margaret was certain. The meeting was scheduled for the next day at Dr. Roberts' office. Margaret prepared carefully, bringing all the official documentation of her position, as well as evidence of the work she had been doing. Dr. Robert and Dr. Michael greeted her with professional courtesy, but Margaret immediately noticed the poorly concealed arrogance in their demeanor. Doctors, I'm here to discuss the situation of Mrs. Josephine Sanders. Margaret got straight to the point. Our mother is being well cared for at the hospital. We don't understand why there's outside interference, Dr. Robert replied coldly. The interference is necessary because we've received complaints that she's being pressured into a nursing home against her will, Margaret explained formally. Our mother needs specialized care that we can't provide at home, Dr. Michael justified. What specialized care? From the medical reports I've seen, she only has normal age-related limitations. Margaret confronted them with facts. The two brothers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Mrs. Wilson, with all due respect, this is a family matter, Dr. Robert tried to end the conversation. It becomes a social issue when it involves violating an elderly person's rights, Margaret responded firmly. Violation? What violation? We're providing the best possible care for our mother, Dr. Michael sounded indignant. The best care would be respecting her wish to stay in her own home, Margaret countered. Her home is in unsuitable condition for someone her age, Dr. Robert lied, trying to create a justification. I visited the house yesterday. It's in perfect condition. Margaret revealed she had done her own investigation. The expressions of the two brothers changed abruptly. They hadn't expected Margaret to be so thorough. Mrs. Wilson, what exactly do you want? Dr. Robert asked impatiently. I want you to respect Mrs. Josephine's right to decide where and how she wants to live, Margaret stated her demand. And what if we decide a nursing home is best for her? Dr. Michael challenged. Then you'll have to face a formal investigation by the public prosecutor's office for violating elderly rights. Margaret played her strongest card. The silence in the room was tense. The two doctors clearly hadn't expected organized legal resistance. Furthermore, I'll make sure the entire medical community in this area knows how two healthcare professionals treat their own elderly mother. Margaret added extra pressure. That's blackmail, Dr. Robert snapped. No, that's consequence. Actions have consequences, doctors. Margaret remained calm. Dr. Michael signaled for his brother to calm down. What do you propose as a solution? He asked more diplomatically. Mrs. Josephine returns to her home with home care support if needed, and you respect her decisions about her own life. Margaret proposed, what if she can't take care of herself alone? Dr. Robert asked, then we'll arrange proper support. But the final decision will always be hers, not yours. Margaret was clear. The siblings asked for time to talk privately. Margaret waited in the lobby, confident her approach was working. When they returned, Dr. Michael spoke for both of them. We agree our mother can return home as long as she has the necessary support, he announced. Excellent. I'll organize all the required assistance. Margaret sounded pleased. But we want to make it clear this doesn't mean we've changed our minds about what's best for her, Dr. Robert added defensively. Your opinions are irrelevant. What matters is Mrs. Josephine's wishes. Margaret was direct. Leaving the office, Margaret felt victorious, but also reflective. She had secured an important win for Mrs. Josephine, but she knew the battle was far from over. Dr. Robert and Dr. Michael weren't like Richard, who had shown genuine capacity for change. They seemed motivated only by convenience and fear of social consequences. Margaret spent the following days arranging Mrs. Josephine's return home. She hired a part-time caregiver, organized home support services, and ensured the elderly woman had all the resources she needed. "Mrs. Wilson, how can I ever thank you for all you've done for me?" Josephine asked when she was finally back in her home. "By living your life with dignity and showing your sons they were wrong about you," Margaret replied. "But what if they try to force me out again?" Josephine voiced her concern. "They won't try. They know they're being watched. Now," Margaret reassured her. Over the next few weeks, Margaret closely monitored Josephine's situation. The elderly woman was thriving in her own home, showing a vitality that had been suppressed during the crisis. But Margaret knew Dr. Robert and Dr. Michael hadn't given up completely. They were just waiting for the right moment to try again. Her suspicion was confirmed when she received a call from Josephine, clearly distressed. "Mrs. Wilson, my sons are saying they can no longer pay for the caregiver and support services." Josephine reported worriedly. "But didn't you tell me you had your own funds for this?" Margaret asked. "I do, but they control my bank account. They say it's to protect me from scams." Josephine revealed a problem Margaret hadn't anticipated. Margaret immediately realized she had underestimated the manipulative abilities of Josephine's sons. They had found an indirect way to pressure their mother. "Mrs. Josephine, we'll fix this. You have the right to control your own finances," Margaret assured her. "But how? They're my sons. They have power of attorney over my affairs." Josephine explained her vulnerability. Margaret realized she was facing a more complex situation than she had imagined. This wasn't just about housing. It was about financial control and systematic manipulation. "Josephine, was that power of attorney given voluntarily, or were you pressured?" Margaret asked. "They said it was necessary to protect me. That elderly people are easy targets for scammers," Josephine replied, showing she had been manipulated. Margaret knew she would need specialized legal help to resolve this. She called Mark, who, besides being an accountant, had connections in the legal field. "Mark, I need a lawyer specializing in elder rights. Urgently," Margaret explained the situation. "I know someone excellent, Dr. Sandra Ferguson. She's handled similar cases before," Mark recommended. The meeting with Dr. Sandra took place the next day. The lawyer listened carefully to Margaret's account of Josephine's situation. "This is a classic case of financial elder abuse," diagnosed Dr. Sandra. "The power of attorney can be revoked, but we need to prove it was obtained through manipulation." "How can we do that?" Margaret asked. "First, by speaking with Mrs. Josephine to understand exactly how the power of attorney was obtained. Then, by filing a motion to revoke it." Dr. Sandra explained the process. "How long will this take?" Margaret wanted to know. "A few weeks? If we have clear evidence," Dr. Sandra estimated. Margaret knew that a few weeks might be too long. Josephine could be pressured into giving up her home during that time. "Is there any way to protect Mrs. Josephine during the legal process?" Margaret asked. "We can request a temporary protective order," Dr. Sandra suggested. "Do that, and I'll cover all the legal fees and costs," Margaret decided. When Margaret explained the situation to Josephine, the elderly woman was hesitant at first. "Mrs. Wilson, they're my children. I don't want to fight them in court," Josephine expressed the inner conflict common among many seniors. "Josephine, they're already fighting you. They're using your motherly love as a weapon against you," Margaret said directly but gently. "But what if I lose? What if they get even angrier with me?" Josephine voiced her fears. "You won't be alone in this fight. I'll be with you every step of the way," Margaret promised. "You'd really do that? Why do you care so much about me?" Josephine asked emotionally. "Because I know exactly how you feel, and because every person deserves to live with dignity, no matter their age," Margaret replied sincerely. Josephine fell silent for a few minutes, processing the decision she had to make. "All right, I'll stand up to my children," she declared with renewed determination. The legal process began the following week. Dr. Sandra filed a motion to revoke the power of attorney and also requested a protective order to prevent Josephine's children from making any financial decisions on her behalf during the proceedings. The reaction from Dr. Robert and Dr. Michael was immediate and furious. They confronted Margaret directly, demanding she back off. "Mrs. Wilson, you're interfering in family matters that are none of your concern," Dr. Robert challenged her in her office. "I'm protecting the rights of an elderly woman who's being financially abused," Margaret replied calmly. "Abused? We're protecting our mother." Dr. Michael raised his voice. "Protecting her from what? From the right to control her own life?" Margaret countered. "Our mother is no longer capable of making important decisions," Dr. Robert claimed. "Based on what medical evaluation? Because there's nothing in her records indicating mental incapacity." Margaret had done her research. The two brothers were left speechless. They knew they had no medical basis for their claims. "Mrs. Wilson, you're making a mistake. We have influence in this town," Dr. Michael made a veiled threat. "And I have influence across the entire state. Not to mention the law and justice on my side." Margaret didn't back down. "This isn't over," Dr. Robert threatened before leaving. "I hope not. I hope you reconsider your actions and start treating your mother with the respect she deserves." Margaret had the last word. After they left, Margaret realized she had declared open war against two powerful and unscrupulous men, but she didn't regret it. Some battles are worth fighting. In the following days, Margaret began to feel the pressure of the influence Dr. Michael had mentioned. Some suppliers for her projects started cancelling contracts without explanation. Negative rumors about her work began circulating quietly. "Margaret, I think you're facing a sabotage campaign," Charles observed after analyzing the cancellations. "I expected this. Men like Robert and Michael don't accept defeat easily," Margaret replied without surprise. "Do you want to reconsider your involvement in the case?" Charles asked, concerned. "Never. If I back down now, I'm validating the idea that people in power can abuse the elderly without consequences," Margaret stated firmly. "Then let's prepare for a longer, harder fight." Charles stood by her side. The sabotage escalated when Margaret received a call from City Hall informing her that there were irregularities in some of her projects that needed investigation. "What kind of irregularities?" Margaret asked the official. "Administrative issues that need clarification. Nothing serious, but the projects are suspended until the investigation is complete," the official explained vaguely. Margaret knew it. Was retaliation orchestrated by the brothers? But she decided to methodically counter each accusation, proving her projects were flawless. Meanwhile, Josephine's situation worsened. Without access to her own finances, she relied on Margaret's goodwill to maintain her home care services. "Miss Margaret, I can't let you pay for everything for me," Josephine protested during a visit. "It's temporary, Josephine. Once you regain control of your finances, you can repay me if you want," Margaret reassured her. "What if we can't?" "Revoke the power of attorney?" Josephine voiced her worry. "We will, I'm sure of it," Margaret replied with conviction. But deep down, Margaret knew she was facing more determined and unscrupulous opponents than ever before. The investigation into her projects lasted 3 weeks, during which she had to provide detailed documentation for every expense, procedure, and decision. It was an exhausting process, clearly designed to intimidate her. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. When she was finally cleared of all accusations, Margaret felt victorious but exhausted. The battle was taking a physical and emotional toll she hadn't anticipated. "Margaret, you need to rest. You're wearing yourself out," Charles noted worriedly. "I can't rest while Josephine is still vulnerable," Margaret replied, though she knew he was right. "Then at least accept more help. You don't have to carry everything alone," Charles suggested. Margaret agreed to take on more support from her team, but kept direct control of Josephine's case. It was too personal to delegate entirely. The hearing to revoke the power of attorney was scheduled for a month later. Margaret knew this would be the decisive moment, not just for Josephine but for her own work in the region. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Dr. Robert and Dr. Michael intensified their attacks. They publicly questioned Margaret's competence, suggesting she was manipulating vulnerable seniors for her own benefit. "They're trying to flip the narrative," Dr. Sandra observed during a strategy meeting. "How do we counter that?" Margaret asked. by presenting clear evidence of their manipulation of Miss Josephine and documenting all their sabotage attempts against you, Dr. Sandra explained. They're influential people. The judge might be swayed. Margaret voiced a realistic concern. That's why we need an airtight case. No room for interpretation, Dr. Sandra replied. In the final weeks before the hearing, Margaret intensified her documentation of everything related to the case. She recorded conversations with legal authorization, collected witness testimonies, and organized a detailed timeline of events. Josephine, in turn, grew increasingly determined to confront her children. Mrs. Wilson, for the first time in years, I feel strong again, she said during a conversation. How so? Margaret asked. Because I finally have someone on my side. Someone who believes I'm worth something, Josephine explained emotionally. You've always been worth it, Josephine. You were just being prevented from showing it, Margaret replied tenderly. The day of the hearing arrived. Margaret accompanied Josephine to the courthouse where they encountered Dr. Robert and Dr. Michael with their lawyers. The tension was palpable. During the hearing, Dr. Sandra Ferguson presented detailed evidence of the manipulation exerted by Josephine's children. She showed how they had used financial control to pressure their mother into accepting decisions she didn't want. The siblings' lawyers argued that the power of attorney was necessary to protect Josephine from malicious outside influences, a clear reference to Margaret. Your Honor, the petitioner is being manipulated by individuals with ulterior motives regarding her situation, Dr. Roberts' lawyer argued. Dr. Ferguson countered by presenting the timeline of events, demonstrating that all of Josephine's problems began when her children decided she was a burden. Your Honor, the respondents used the power of attorney not to protect their mother, but to control her and force her to accept decisions against her wishes and needs, Dr. Ferguson argued convincingly. Josephine was called to testify. Margaret watched anxiously as the elderly woman, trembling but resolute, recounted her version of events. Your Honor, I just want to live in my home, with my things, my memories. I don't want to be a burden to anyone, but I also don't want to be treated like an object, Josephine said emotionally. Dr. Robert tried to interrupt, but was reprimanded by the judge. When it was the siblings' turn to testify, their versions began to show contradictions. Dr. Michael claimed their mother was incapable of caring for herself, but couldn't explain why she had lived independently for years before they decided to intervene. Dr. Robert attempted to justify the financial control as protection, but when questioned about why they hadn't consulted their mother on decisions, he couldn't provide a proper answer. After 2 hours of testimony, the judge announced he would deliver his decision the following week. How do you think it went? Margaret asked Dr. Ferguson as they left the courthouse. Well, the judge seemed to see through their contradictions. Dr. Ferguson replied optimistically. And now? Josephine asked anxiously. Now we wait, Margaret answered, holding the elderly woman's hand in support. The week of waiting was tense. Margaret continued her other work, but her mind was constantly on Josephine's case. She knew a loss here could set a dangerous precedent for other seniors in similar situations. Dr. Robert and Dr. Michael used that week to intensify their smear campaign against Margaret, spreading rumors about her motives and questioning her integrity. Margaret, maybe we should prepare a plan B in case the decision goes against us, Charles suggested pragmatically. There won't be a plan B. We'll win because justice is on our side, Margaret replied firmly. On Friday, Dr. Ferguson called with the news Margaret had been eagerly awaiting. Margaret, we won! The judge revoked the power of attorney and ruled that Mrs. Sanders regained full control of her finances, Dr. Ferguson announced triumphantly. Margaret felt a wave of relief and satisfaction. It wasn't just a legal victory, but a validation. Felt that her fight was worth it. How did your brothers react? Margaret asked. They'll appeal, but the judge was very clear in his decision. It will be hard to overturn, Dr. Sandra explained. Margaret immediately called Josephine to share the news. Josephine, we won. You've regained control of your life, Margaret announced emotionally. On the other end of the line, Josephine cried with joy. Mrs. Wilson, I don't know how to thank you. You've given me back my dignity, Josephine said through tears. You always had dignity, Josephine. Now you also have legal recognition of it, Margaret replied. In the following days, Josephine took back control of her finances and reorganized her life the way she wanted. She kept the home support services, but now paid for them with her own resources. Dr. Robert and Dr. Michael made some half-hearted attempts at reconciliation with their mother, but Josephine, strengthened by her legal victory, set clear boundaries about how she wanted to be treated. "My sons only seek me out now because they know they can't control me anymore," Josephine observed during a conversation with Margaret. "And how do you feel about that?" Margaret asked. "Sad, but also relieved. I'd rather have distant sons who respect me than close ones who control me," Josephine replied wisely. The victory in Josephine's case had repercussions far beyond her individual situation. The local press covered the story, highlighting both the elderly woman's courage and Margaret's work in defending seniors' rights. The media exposure brought to light several other similar cases in the region. Margaret began receiving calls from seniors and family members reporting abuse and control situations. "Margaret, it seems you've opened Pandora's box," Charles commented on the influx of new cases. "A necessary Pandora's box. How many people were suffering in silence?" Margaret responded. The case's impact also strengthened Margaret's standing in the community. Dr. Robert and Dr. Michael's attempts to sabotage her lost credibility, and support for her work multiplied. A few months later, Margaret received a surprising call. It was Dr. Michael, and his voice sounded different. "Mrs. Wilson, I'd like to speak with you in person," he requested. "About what?" Margaret asked cautiously. "About my mother, and about my mistakes," Dr. Michael replied with a humility Margaret hadn't expected. "You can come to my office tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Margaret agreed to the meeting. Dr. Michael arrived punctually, but seemed very different from the arrogant man Margaret had faced months before. His eyes showed exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Mrs. Wilson, I came here to apologize," he began directly. "Apologize for what, specifically?" Margaret wanted to hear his version. "For treating my mother like an object. For trying to control her life. For trying to sabotage her when you tried to help her." Dr. Michael listed his failures. Margaret watched him carefully, trying to determine if his regret was sincere. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I finally understood I was wrong, completely wrong," Dr. Michael answered. "How did you come to that conclusion?" Margaret asked, curious about his transformation. "By talking to my own teenage daughter. She asked me how I'd want to be treated when I grew old, and I couldn't answer without feeling ashamed," Dr. Michael explained. Margaret was moved by the honesty of his answer. "And Robert? Has he changed his mind too?" Margaret asked about his brother. "No. Robert still thinks we were right. Our relationship is complicated," Dr. Michael admitted. "And your mother? How is your relationship with her?" Margaret asked the most important question. "Strained. She treats me with courtesy, but I can see the hurt in her eyes," Dr. Michael replied sadly. "And what do you expect from me?" Margaret asked directly. "Advice on how to regain my mother's trust," Dr. Michael requested humbly. Margaret paused for a moment before answering. "Michael, rebuilding trust after breaking it is a long and difficult process. It requires genuine changes in behavior, not just words," she explained. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," Dr. Michael declared. "Then start by treating your mother as the independent, capable person she is. Ask for her opinion on decisions that affect her. Show respect for her choices," Margaret advised. "What if she never forgives me?" Dr. Michael asked fearfully. "Then you'll have to learn to live with the consequences of your actions. But at least you'll know you did the right thing," Margaret answered honestly. Dr. Michael left the meeting visibly thoughtful. Margaret felt hopeful that at least one of Josephine's children might experience a genuine transformation. In the following months, Margaret observed from a distance Dr. Michael's efforts to rebuild his relationship with Josephine. He began visiting her regularly, always respecting her autonomy and asking permission before making any suggestions. "How do you feel about the changes in Michael?" Margaret asked Josephine during one of her visits. "I'm still cautious, but I can see he's really trying to be different," Josephine replied. "And is that enough for you?" Margaret asked. "For now. Maybe with time, we can rebuild something close to what we had before, Josephine said hopefully. Josephine's case became a milestone in Margaret's work, not just for the legal victory, but for proving it was possible to stand up to powerful opponents and prevail when justice was on your side. The experience also taught Margaret important lessons about the varying levels of resistance she would face in her work. Not all cases would be as straightforward as Richard's transformation. Some would require prolonged legal battles and direct confrontation with unscrupulous people. 6 months after the court ruling, Margaret organized a ceremony to celebrate the first anniversary of her support network for elderly people rejected by their families. Josephine was one of the keynote speakers. "A year ago, I thought my life was over," Josephine told the audience. "Today I know it was just beginning a new phase, one where I'm finally respected as the person I've always been." Josephine's speech moved the entire audience. Her transformation from a vulnerable victim to an empowered woman was inspiring to everyone present. During the ceremony, Margaret was surprised by Dr. Michael's presence. He hadn't come as an official guest, but as his mother's companion. "Mrs. Wilson, I'd like to say something publicly if you'll allow me," Dr. Michael requested during the event. Margaret hesitated but decided to give him the opportunity. "As a doctor and more importantly as a son, I'd like to publicly thank Mrs. Wilson for her work," Dr. Michael began his speech. "She didn't just protect my mother when I failed to. She taught me what it truly means to love and respect a parent." Dr. Michael's words had a strong impact on the audience. Seeing a respected professional publicly acknowledge his mistakes and thank an outsider's intervention was powerful. After the ceremony, Margaret reflected on how Josephine's case had become something much bigger than an individual situation. It had raised awareness about a social issue, set legal precedents, and even contributed to the transformation of some people. "Margaret, do you realize the impact you're making?" Charles remarked as they drove home. "I'm starting to," she replied. "But there's still so much work to be done," Margaret replied. "Do you have the energy to keep going?" Charles asked, concerned about Margaret's intense workload. "I do. Every case like Josephine's gives me more strength to continue," Margaret answered with conviction. In the months that followed, Margaret organized the lessons learned from Josephine's case, creating more efficient protocols to handle similar situations. She also formed partnerships with specialized lawyers in various cities, building a legal support network for elderly people in vulnerable situations. The work grew organically, always rooted in real cases and identified needs. Margaret never lost sight of her original mission, to ensure that older adults were treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. A year and a half after Josephine's case, Margaret received a call that made her reflect on her own journey. It was Richard, calling to share news about his life. "Mom, Patricia is pregnant," he announced joyfully. Margaret was surprised and moved by the news. "Congratulations, son. How are you both feeling?" she asked. "We're very happy. And a little nervous too," Richard admitted. "Nervous? Why?" Margaret asked. "Because we want to be better parents than we were children," Richard said sincerely. His answer touched Margaret deeply. It was confirmation that her own experience had helped break a cycle of disrespect that could have continued. "Richard, you'll both be wonderful parents. You've learned important lessons about respect and unconditional love," she reassured him. "Mom, we want you to be an involved grandmother in our child's life," Richard invited. "It would be an honor," Margaret accepted, moved. "And we also want our child to learn from your example, how to be strong and independent," Richard added. Margaret smiled, realizing her journey had created impacts far beyond what she'd initially imagined. "I'm sure they'll learn many good things from both of you," she replied affectionately. After the call, Margaret reflected on how her life had completely transformed. From a rejected and humiliated woman, she had become a symbol of strength and dignity for her own family and hundreds of others. But she knew there were still important challenges ahead. Her work had grown so much that maintaining the quality and personal attention she considered essential was becoming difficult. "Charles, I need to make some decisions about the future of our work," she remarked during a conversation. "What kind of decisions?" he asked, Whether we keep expanding or if it's time to consolidate what we have and ensure its quality, Margaret explained her dilemma. What does your heart say? Charles asked, knowing her tendency to follow intuition. It says quality matters more than quantity, that it's better to do fewer things but do them exceptionally well, she answered after thinking. This reflection led Margaret to an important decision. Instead of continuing to expand geographically, she would focus on deepening and refining existing programs. She began delegating more responsibilities to her team, stepping into a strategic, mentoring role rather than operational management. This gave her more time for complex cases and her personal life. One of the first things she did with this extra time was organize a family meeting with Richard and Patricia to discuss the future, especially the baby's arrival. I want you to know that despite everything in the past, I'm here to support you as family, Margaret said during the meeting. Mum, we want you to be an active part of our child's life, Richard declared. But we also want to set healthy boundaries from the beginning, Patricia added, showing she had learned about clear communication. Margaret appreciated Patricia's honesty. I completely agree. Clear boundaries are healthy for everyone, she replied. What kind of boundaries do you have in mind? Margaret asked, wanting to understand their expectations. We want you to be the loving and present grandmother, but not the primary caregiver, Richard explained. And we want you to respect our decisions about education and upbringing, even when you disagree, Patricia added. Margaret smiled at the conditions set. Those are very reasonable boundaries, and in return I expect you to respect my independence and my life choices, she stated her own terms. Of course, Mom, Richard agreed immediately. The conversation marked a new chapter in their family relationship. It was based on mutual respect and clear communication, very different from the previous dynamic built on unspoken expectations and control. A few months later, Margaret was surprised by a call from Carmen, her former neighbor and first ally during the crisis. Margaret, I need to talk to you about something important, Carmen said urgently. Of course, Carmen, what happened? Margaret asked, concerned. It's about Mark. He's going through a tough situation with his wife, Carmen explained about her son. What kind of situation? Margaret asked. She's pressuring me to move in with them because it's too expensive to maintain 2 houses. But I don't want to leave my home, Carmen shared. Margaret felt a familiar pang of indignation. It was a subtler version of what had happened to her, but just as troubling. And Mark, what's his stance? Margaret asked. He's torn. He wants to help me, but he also doesn't want problems with his wife, Carmen explained. Her son's difficult position. Carmen, do you have the means to stay independent? Margaret asked the practical question. Yes, I do. My pension is enough, and I have some savings. I'm not rich like you, but I don't need to depend on anyone, Carmen replied. Then the issue isn't financial, it's about control. Margaret identified the core problem. Exactly. Mark's wife wants me nearby so she can supervise me and save money. Carmen understood the situation. Margaret thought about how to help Carmen without interfering too much in her family dynamics. Carmen, how about we arrange a conversation between you, Mark, and his wife? With professional mediation, Margaret suggested. You'd do that? Carmen asked hopefully. Of course, you supported me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn to return the favor, Margaret replied without hesitation. The family mediation was scheduled for the following week. Margaret invited a psychologist specializing in family relations to lead the session. During the meeting, it became clear that Mark's wife, Samantha, had financial motivations, but also legitimate anxieties about the future. Mrs. Carmen, it's not that I don't like you. I'm just worried about what will happen if you get sick or need care, Samantha explained her concerns. And those concerns are valid, the psychologist affirmed. But the way to address them is through planning, not control. What do you mean by planning? Mark asked. By discussing future scenarios, setting contingency plans, organizing documents, but always respecting Mrs. Carmen's autonomy, the psychologist explained. Margaret observed the session quietly, stepping in only when necessary. She was impressed by how professional mediation was clarifying issues that could have turned into serious family conflicts. Samantha, I understand your concerns, but I can commit to managing my own future responsibly, Carmen asserted. How? Samantha asked. Getting a more comprehensive health insurance, organizing my documents, setting clear guidelines about medical care, Carmen listed. And we can also schedule regular check-ins so you know how I'm doing, Carmen offered as a compromise. The meeting ended with clear agreements on how to handle the situation. Carmen would maintain her independence, but with better communication and family planning. Margaret, thank you for organizing this. You prevented a serious family crisis. Mark thanked her after the session. You're welcome, Mark. I've learned that preventing conflicts is much better than solving them after they've already caused damage, Margaret replied. Her experience with Carmen inspired Margaret to develop a new service, preventive family mediation for aging-related issues. It was a way to stop families from reaching the point of destructive conflict she had experienced. The service launched 3 months later and was immediately in demand. Many families were facing similar tensions and appreciated having a neutral space to discuss sensitive matters. During one of these mediation sessions, Margaret worked with a family whose situation made her reflect deeply on her own journey. It was a 50-year-old man who wanted his 75-year-old mother to move out because his wife didn't feel comfortable with her presence. My mother has always lived with us, but now that the kids are grown, my wife thinks we need more privacy, the man explained. Margaret listened with a sense of déjà vu. It was essentially the same situation she had faced with Richard and Patricia. And you, ma'am? How do you feel about this proposal? Margaret asked the elderly woman. I don't want to leave my home. This is my family. Where would I go? The woman replied, tears in her eyes. Margaret saw herself in that woman. The same pain, the same confusion, the same feeling of rejection. Son, may I ask you something? Margaret addressed the man. How would you feel if in the future your children asked you to leave your home? That's different, the man began to justify. How is it different? Margaret pressed. The man had no response. Margaret seized the moment to share her own experience. I went through the same thing your mother is facing. I was kicked out of my own home by my son, she revealed. The room fell silent. Margaret's honesty had completely shifted the conversation. What was that like? The man's wife asked, showing genuine interest for the first time. It was devastating. I felt rejected, humiliated, worthless, Margaret shared honestly. But you seem to have recovered well, the man observed. I did recover, yes. But it was a long and painful process that could have been avoided if my son had chosen a different approach, Margaret explained. What approach? The wife asked. By talking honestly about their needs, looking for solutions that respected everyone involved instead of just discarding me, Margaret elaborated. The session continued for 2 hours, with Margaret mediating a deep conversation about family needs, mutual respect, and creative solutions. In the end, the family decided to restructure the house to create more privacy for everyone, instead of forcing the mother to leave. Mrs. Wilson, thank you for helping us find a better solution, the elderly woman said emotionally. You're welcome. It's rewarding to turn my painful experience into something that helps others, Margaret replied. Cases like this became increasingly common in Margaret's work. She had discovered that her personal experience, as painful as it was, gave her unique credibility and empathy to help other families. 7 years after being forced out of her home, Margaret was organizing a grand ceremony to celebrate the results of her work. Hundreds of families had benefited from the programs she had developed. Richard and Patricia were among the guests, now with a 2-year-old son who affectionately called Margaret Grandma Lena. Mum, I wanted to say something publicly today, Richard requested during the ceremony. What? Margaret asked curiously. I want to apologize again, but this time for everyone to hear, Richard explained. Margaret was surprised but moved by his intention. During his speech at the ceremony, Richard took the microphone. I want to take this opportunity to talk about my mother, not just as the coordinator of these wonderful programs, but as the woman I mistreated and who taught me the true meaning of forgiveness and growth, Richard began. The audience fell silent, sensing he was sharing something deeply personal. 7 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I kicked my mother out of the house, Richard confessed publicly. Today I see the extraordinary woman she always was, the one I was too blind to recognize back then. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. Richard's courage to expose himself this way showed how much he had truly changed. She taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened, but giving someone the chance to prove they can be better, Richard continued. And I hope my son grows up knowing this improved version of his father, thanks to the lessons I learned from her. Richard's speech was met with a warm ovation from the crowd. Margaret stepped onto the stage and embraced her son. A moment of emotional reconciliation that meant far more than a public gesture. "Thank you, son, for having the courage to grow and change," Margaret whispered in his ear. "Thank you for having the patience to teach me," Richard replied. That night, after the ceremony, Margaret sat at home reflecting on the extraordinary journey she had lived. Charles approached and sat beside her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Complete," Margaret answered without hesitation. "For the first time in a long while, I feel completely at peace with my life." "Why?" Charles asked. "Because I turned my greatest pain into my greatest purpose. Because I have relationships built on respect. Because I know who I am and value myself no matter what others think," Margaret listed. "And the future, how do you see it?" Charles asked. "I see it with calm. I've built something that will continue even when I'm no longer here. I have a family who loves me for who I am. I have a partner who supports me," Margaret smiled. "I have inner peace." 3 months after the ceremony, Margaret received a call that would test her ability to handle difficult situations once again. It was from an old acquaintance facing circumstances similar to what Margaret had endured. "Margaret, my daughter wants to put me in a nursing home. She says it's for my own good, but I know it's because she wants to sell my house," the acquaintance shared. Margaret listened with a mix of sadness and determination. Even after all the work she had done, there were still people experiencing the same disrespect and rejection. "Do you want to fight for your rights?" Margaret asked directly. "I do, but I don't know how. I don't have resources like you did," the acquaintance replied. "Financial resources help, but they aren't the most important thing. What matters is knowing you have worth and rights that deserve respect," Margaret explained. "Can you help me?" the acquaintance asked. "Of course, that's exactly what our work is for," Margaret answered without hesitation. Once again, Margaret became involved in a case protecting seniors' rights, but this time she had an experienced team and an established support network to make the process smoother. The case was resolved within a few weeks, with the daughter of the acquaintance being forced to respect her mother's wish to remain in her own home. "Margaret, how can I thank you?" the acquaintance asked after the resolution. "By helping others who go through the same situation, by sharing your story so others know they don't have to accept being disrespected," Margaret replied. This experience confirmed for Margaret that she had created not just programs, but a social movement valuing and protecting the rights of the elderly. 8 years after being kicked out of her home, Margaret decided to write a second book, this time focusing on the lessons learned from all the cases she had handled. "This book will be different from the first," she explained to Charles. "The first was about my personal journey. This one will be about the lessons we can all learn." "What kind of lessons?" Charles asked. "About building relationships based on respect, about aging with dignity, about how families can support one another without controlling one another." Margaret listed the themes. The process of writing the second book was even more revealing than the first. Margaret had to synthesize years of experience into clear, applicable principles. One of the chapters she was most proud of was about the power of conscious choice. In it, she explained how all people, at any age, have the power to choose how to respond to the circumstances of their lives. "We can't control what others do to us," Margaret wrote, "but we can always control how we respond to what others do to us." Another important chapter addressed the difference between helping and controlling. It was based on her experience with dozens of families who confused care with control. "Helping means providing support so the person can make their own choices," Margaret wrote. "Controlling means making decisions for them, even if it's for their own good." The book was released a year later and had an even greater impact. than the first. It wasn't just Margaret's personal story, but a practical guide for anyone who wanted to build healthier, more respectful relationships. During the launch, Margaret was approached by journalists who wanted to know about her future plans. "Ms. Wilson, do you plan to expand your work to other states?" one journalist asked. "My focus isn't on geographical expansion, but on deepening the impact," Margaret replied. "I'd rather make a real difference in a few lives than a superficial difference in many." "And personally, how do you see your future?" another journalist asked. "I see it with peace and gratitude," Margaret answered. "I've built a life based on my values. I have healthy relationships, and I know my work will continue to help people, even when I'm no longer here." Margaret's response reflected the inner peace she had achieved. She was no longer the insecure woman seeking external validation. She was a woman who knew her worth and lived by her principles. 9 years after being kicked out of her home, Margaret was surprised by a call from Dr. Robert, the brother of Dr. Michael, who had never shown remorse for the Josephine Sanders case. "Ms. Wilson, I'd like to speak with you," he said with a humility Margaret had never heard in his voice. "About what?" Margaret asked cautiously. "About mistakes I've made and lessons I need to learn," Dr. Robert replied. Margaret was intrigued. Dr. Robert had been the more resistant of the two brothers, the one who had never shown any sign of change. "You can come to my office tomorrow," Margaret agreed to the meeting. Dr. Robert arrived visibly different, more humble, more reflective, less arrogant than Margaret remembered. "Mrs. Wilson, I came here to admit I was completely wrong about my mother and about you," he began directly. "What changed your perspective?" Margaret asked curiously. "My father passed away last month," Dr. Robert revealed. "During his illness, my mother cared for him with such devotion that it made me realize how extraordinary she has always been." Margaret was moved by his words. "And how do you feel about that?" she asked. "Ashamed, regretful, and determined to be a better son for the years I still have with her," Dr. Robert answered sincerely. "And your mother, how did she react to your attempts to reconnect?" Margaret inquired. "With caution, but also with affection. She's more generous with me than I deserve," Dr. Robert admitted. Margaret studied him carefully, weighing whether his transformation was genuine. "Robert, what do you expect from me?" she asked. "Advice on how to regain my mother's trust, and also as forgiveness for the attacks I made on your work," Dr. Robert requested humbly. Margaret took a moment before responding. "Robert, forgiveness you already have. As for advice, it's simple. Treat your mother like the valuable, capable person she has always been." "That's it, Doctor?" Robert asked, surprised by the simplicity. "That's it, but it's also everything," Margaret explained. "Genuine respect is the foundation of all healthy relationships." Dr. Robert left the meeting visibly relieved and determined. Margaret felt satisfied seeing that even the most resistant people could experience real change when the right circumstances arose. The reconciliation between Dr. Robert and Josephine was gradual but real. Margaret watched from a distance as the family slowly rebuilt relationships based on mutual respect. "It's rewarding to see families coming together in a healthy way," Margaret remarked to Charles. "Especially after all you went through to reach this point," Charles replied. "Every family that reconciles makes all the suffering I endured worthwhile," Margaret reflected. 10 years after being cast out of her home, Margaret organized a grand celebration to mark a decade of her social work. The ceremony gathered hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her programs. During the event, Margaret was surprised by a video secretly prepared by her team. It featured testimonials from people across the state, thanking her for her work and sharing how their lives had changed. "Mrs. Wilson taught me that age doesn't define ability," said an 85-year-old woman who had started a small business after joining the program. "Thanks to Mrs. Wilson's work, my family learned to value me," declared a man who had been rejected by his children. "She doesn't just save the elderly, she saves entire families," commented a woman who had participated in family mediation. Margaret watched with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by the impact of her work. But the biggest surprise of the night came when Richard took the stage with his 5-year-old son. "Grandma Lena, Dad and I made something for you, the boy said. Into the microphone. What is it, sweetheart? Margaret asked, touched. Dad told me you're the bravest woman in the world, and I want to be brave like you when I grow up, the boy declared innocently. The entire audience was moved by the child's words. For Margaret, hearing this from her grandson marked the full circle of her journey. Thank you, my love. You're already very brave, she replied, hugging him. Richard stepped closer to the microphone. Mom, I want you to know that you didn't just transform your own life. You transformed our family, our community, and thousands of other lives, he said emotionally. But most importantly, you taught us that it's never too late to be a better person, Richard added. That night, Margaret returned home with the feeling that she had fulfilled her life's mission. She had turned her greatest pain into her greatest purpose and created a legacy that would continue to impact lives for many years. Charles noticed her thoughtful expression. What are you thinking about? He asked. I'm thinking about how extraordinary it is that the worst thing that ever happened to me became the best thing I've done in my life, Margaret replied. Do you have any regrets? Charles asked. None. Every pain, every tear, every moment of humiliation was worth it to get where I am today, Margaret answered with conviction. And now, what comes next? Charles asked about the future. Now I'll keep doing what I love, surrounded by people who love me, until the day I no longer can, Margaret replied calmly. A year after the 10-year celebration, Margaret decided to take a step that would mark the final consolidation of her transformation. She organized a special ceremony where she would officially pass the leadership of her programs to the team she had trained. It's time for you all to fly on your own, Margaret told her team during the transition ceremony. But what if we need you? One of the coordinators asked. I'll always be here as a mentor and advisor, but you already have all the knowledge and experience needed to carry this work forward, Margaret reassured them. The ceremony was emotional for Margaret. It represented not just the passing of responsibilities, but the confirmation that she had created something sustainable and lasting. Richard was present at the ceremony, now with a second child, 2 years old. Mum, I'm proud to see the legacy you've built, he said afterward. The legacy isn't the program, son. The legacy is the people who've been transformed, including you, Margaret replied. I know, and I want you to know I tell this story to my children regularly, Richard revealed. What story? Margaret asked. The story of the grandmother who was kicked out of her home and became one of the most respected women in the region. The story of how to turn pain into purpose, Richard explained. Margaret smiled, realizing her story was already becoming a family legend to be passed down to future generations. 2 years after the leadership transition, Margaret was enjoying a quiet but active retirement. She stayed involved in special cases and continued writing, but at a much more relaxed pace. It was during this time that she received a call that made her reflect on the lasting impact of her journey. Mrs. Wilson, my name is Fern. I'm a social worker in another city and would like to consult you about a case, the young woman introduced herself. Of course, how can I help? Margaret replied. We have a situation here very similar to what you went through 12 years ago. An elderly woman being pressured by her children to leave her home, Fern explained. And how can I help? Margaret asked. We'd like to use your methodology, and also, we were wondering if you could speak with the woman. She's read your books and specifically asked to talk to you, Fern revealed. Margaret was moved to hear that her story was still inspiring and helping people. Of course I can speak with her, she agreed immediately. The conversation with the elderly woman was emotional. The 78-year-old had read Margaret's books and found the strength to resist her children's pressure. Mrs. Wilson, your story gave me the courage not to accept being treated as disposable, the woman said tearfully. I'm so happy to hear that. Remember, you have value no matter what anyone says or does, Margaret advised. But what if I can't? Resolve my situation the way you did, the elderly woman asked fearfully. Then at least you tried. And that's already a victory in itself, Margaret replied. But most importantly, remember you're not alone. There are people and organizations ready to help you, Margaret added. The conversation lasted 2 hours, with Margaret sharing not just practical advice, but also emotional support and hope. 3 months later, Fern called again with news. "Mrs. Wilson, I wanted to thank you." The case was resolved positively. The elderly woman regained control of her life with the help of the methodology you developed, Fern reported. "That's wonderful. How is she feeling?" Margaret asked. "She said she feels the way you must have felt, free and valued." Fern relayed the message. Margaret hung up the phone with a deep sense of satisfaction. Even 12 years after her own crisis, her journey was still impacting and helping others. That afternoon, Margaret decided to do something she hadn't done in a long time. She visited the house where she had lived for 40 years and from which she had been expelled. The house now served as a training center for seniors and was full of life and activity. She walked through the rooms that had once been her home, observing how they had been transformed into classrooms, workshops, and communal spaces. "How does it feel being here?" Charles asked, accompanying her on the visit. "At peace," Margaret replied. "This house was once the place of my greatest humiliation. Now it's where others discover their strength and worth." "Do you miss the life you had here?" Charles asked. "No, that life was based on dependence and seeking approval. I prefer the life I have now, built on self-worth and purpose," Margaret answered without hesitation. They sat in the garden Margaret had tended for decades, now maintained by program participants. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" Charles requested. "Of course," she permitted. "If you could go back in time and change what happened, would you?" Charles asked. Margaret reflected deeply before answering. "I wouldn't, because if I did, I might never have discovered who I truly am. I might never have helped all the people I've helped. I might never have met you," she answered honestly. "Even knowing all the pain you went through?" Charles pressed. "Especially knowing all the pain I went through. Because it was through the pain that I found my strength," Margaret explained. Just then, Richard appeared in the garden with his 2 children. "Mom, I brought the kids to see where Grandma used to live," he said. "Grandma, this house is so pretty," the older grandson said. "It is. And now it's a place where special people come to learn new things," Margaret explained to the children. "Like you, Grandma?" the grandson asked innocently. "Like me, sweetheart. We never stop learning," Margaret replied with a smile. As she watched her grandchildren playing in the garden she had nurtured, Margaret felt completely fulfilled. Her journey had reached a point where past, present, and future harmonized perfectly. Richard approached her. "Mom, can I confess something?" he asked. "Of course, son," Margaret permitted. "Sometimes I think forcing you out of the house was the best thing that could have happened. Not for me, but for all the people you've helped since," Richard said. "That's an interesting way to see it." Margaret replied, "Of course, I deeply regret what I did, but it's comforting to think even my worst mistakes could contribute to something positive," Richard explained. Margaret looked at her son affectionately. "Richard, your mistakes were the catalyst, but the transformation was my choice, just as your change was yours," she clarified. "I understand." Richard nodded. "What matters is that both of us learned and grew. And now we're raising a new generation with better values," Margaret pointed to her grandchildren. That afternoon, as she walked back home with Charles, Margaret reflected on how her life had found perfect balance. She had healthy relationships, a clear purpose, inner peace, and the certainty that she'd made a difference in the world. "Charles, thank you for sharing this journey with me," she said spontaneously. "Thank you for letting me be part of it," Charles replied. "Do you think our story will inspire others?" Margaret asked. "I'm sure it will, because it's a story about transformation, forgiveness, courage, and the human capacity to grow," Charles answered. Margaret smiled, satisfied with the thought. 15 years after being cast out of her home, she was celebrating her 87th birthday, surrounded by family, friends, and people whose lives she had touched. The party was held at the training center that now operated in her old house, a perfect symbol of her journey of transformation. During the celebration, many people spoke about the impact Margaret had on their lives, but the most moving moment came when her eldest grandson, now 17, asked to speak. "Grandma, I want to thank you for teaching me that strength isn't about never falling but always getting back up," the young man said with surprising maturity. "Thank you, my love," Margaret replied, moved. "And I want you to know I plan to continue your work when I grow up. I want to help people the way you did," her grandson declared. Tears of joy welled in Margaret's eyes. Her legacy was being passed down to the next generation of her own family. Richard approached her after his son's speech. "Mum, he really wants to study to become a social worker. Says he wants to follow in your footsteps," Richard told her. "And do you support that?" Margaret asked. "Completely. It'd be an honor to have a son following his grandmother's example," Richard answered, proudly. That night, Margaret sat at home reflecting on her extraordinary life. From a rejected and humiliated woman, she had become an inspiration to hundreds. Most importantly, she had found peace within herself and built relationships based on love and respect. Charles sat beside her. "How are you feeling on your birthday?" he asked. "Grateful, deeply grateful for every experience, every person, every opportunity to grow," Margaret replied. "Do you have any wishes for the future?" Charles pressed. "Just that the people I love are happy and that the work we started keeps helping others," she answered simply. "And what about you? What do you want for yourself?" Charles insisted. "For me, I just want to keep being the Margaret I discovered I could be. Authentic, independent, loving, but with healthy boundaries," she said. 2 years later, as Margaret was writing her final memoirs, she received a call that filled her with pride. A university was offering a course on active aging and elder rights based on her methodology. "Mrs. Wilson, we'd like you to be the course's emeritus professor," the dean proposed. It would be an honor, Margaret accepted immediately. The creation of the university course marked the ultimate academic recognition of her work. Margaret had gone from being a victim of ageism to a recognized expert in elder rights. During the inaugural class, Margaret looked at the young students and felt hopeful about the future. "What I'll teach you doesn't just come from books," she began her speech. "It comes from a personal journey of discovery, pain, growth, and transformation. Each of you has the power to positively impact the lives of people who feel undervalued by society. But first, you must understand that a person's worth never diminishes with age." Margaret taught. The students listened attentively as Margaret shared not only technical knowledge but life wisdom. "Always remember, you're not just working with the elderly. You're working with people who have accumulated decades of experience, wisdom, and who deserve respect." Margaret concluded her first class. After the lesson, several students approached her with questions and comments. "Professor Margaret, your story inspired me to choose this field," said a young student. "That's wonderful. We need young, idealistic people to carry on this work," Margaret replied encouragingly. Her involvement with the university added a new dimension to Margaret's work. She wasn't just helping people directly, but also shaping the next generation of professionals who would continue her legacy. 3 years after she began teaching, Margaret made a decision that would mark the final phase of her extraordinary journey. At 90 years old, she decided it was time to retire completely and spend her remaining years in total peace. The retirement ceremony was an event that brought together thousands of people. Governors, mayors, social workers, families she had helped, and personal friends were all present. During her farewell speech, Margaret reflected on her entire journey. 20 years ago, I was a woman who thought her life was over. Today, at 90, I can say I've lived many lives within one," she began. "I've been a wife, a mother, a victim, a survivor, an activist, a teacher, a mentor. Each role taught me something different about myself and about life," Margaret continued. "But if I had to choose just one lesson to leave with you, it would be this: never accept being treated as less than you deserve, and never treat others as less than they deserve," Margaret concluded. Her speech was followed by a 10-minute standing ovation. It was the recognition of a life dedicated to turning pain into purpose and making a difference in people's lives. Richard stood on stage with Margaret, now a 60-year-old man who had become an active advocate for the rights of the elderly. "Mom, thank you for teaching me it's never too late to be a better person," he said emotionally. "Thank you for learning, son," Margaret replied. In the following years, Margaret lived peacefully, enjoying her family, Charles's companionship, and the satisfaction of knowing she had fulfilled her life's mission. She received constant visits from people thanking her for her impact, letters from students inspired by her story, and reports about the continued growth of the program she had created. "Margaret, do you have any regrets about your life?" Charles asked during a quiet conversation. "None. Every experience, good or bad, brought me to where I am today," Margaret answered serenely. "And if you could give advice to someone going through a situation like yours," Charles asked, "I'd tell them to remember that every crisis is an opportunity to discover your true strength. That pain can be turned into purpose, and that it's never too late to start over," Margaret replied with her accumulated wisdom. On her 92nd birthday, Margaret was surrounded by 4 generations of her family. Her great-grandchildren played in the garden as she watched with absolute contentment. "Grandma, tell the story again about when you were kicked out of the house," one of the great-grandchildren asked. "Again? But I've told that story so many times." Margaret laughed. "But it's a good story, and you always tell it differently," the child insisted. Margaret smiled and began once more to tell the story that had become a family legend. Once upon a time, there was a woman who thought her life was over. She began, her eyes shining with satisfaction as she saw how her journey continued to inspire even the children in the family. When Margaret finished telling the story, her great-grandson asked a question that moved her deeply. "Grandma, do you want me to be brave like you when I grow up?" the child asked. "I want you to be yourself, with the courage to stand up for what's right and the compassion to help those in need," Margaret answered tenderly. "Just like you did?" the child asked. "In your own way. Everyone has their own way of making a difference in the world," Margaret explained. That afternoon, as she watched her family gathered in harmony, Margaret reflected on how she had completely transformed her life. The rejected and humiliated woman from 20 years ago had become the beloved and respected center of a large, happy family. Most importantly, she had created a legacy that would continue to impact lives for generations. Her programs were still running, her books were still being read, her methodology was still being taught, and her story was still inspiring people. Charles approached her in the garden. "What are you thinking about?" he asked affectionately. "I'm thinking that I made it," Margaret replied simply. "Made what?" Charles asked. "Turned my life into something worth living. Built relationships based on love and respect. Made a difference in other people's lives." Margaret listed her achievements. "And most of all, I discovered who I truly am and learned to value myself," she added. Charles smiled and held her hand. "Margaret, you didn't just transform your own life, you transformed the lives of thousands of others," he observed. "And it all started with $3 million hidden in a bag," Margaret laughed, remembering the beginning of her journey. "No, Margaret, it all started with the courage of a woman who refused to accept being treated as disposable," Charles wisely corrected. Margaret looked around, seeing her family, her home, her garden, and felt complete peace. She had lived an extraordinary life, full of challenges, growth, love, and purpose. The woman who had been cast out of her home at 72 had become an inspiration to thousands. She had proven that it's never too late to start over, never too late to discover your inner strength, and never too late to turn pain into purpose. And as the sun set on that perfect day, Margaret knew her story had reached the most beautiful ending possible, a life lived with dignity, purpose, and love. The end. Now, tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your sincere words in the comments. Do you think Margaret made the right decisions along her journey? We'd love to hear your thoughts on how she turned her greatest pain into her greatest purpose. Thank you so much for joining us on this moving story. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories like this one.